Okay, I now call the fall 2021 Northern Ohio Technical Services Librarians NOTSL meeting to order. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to NOTSL's virtual fall meeting. It's all subjective, modern subject analysis. My name is Regina Hausman, and I'm the chair of NOTSL. Please allow me to introduce the rest of the board. Deborah Climbera, Vice Chair. Nathan Freilich, Past Chair and Scholarship Committee Chair. Aaron Valentine, Secretary. Lord Maidens, Treasurer and Webmaster. Rebecca Belford and Ann Kumar, Executive Committee. Chloe Bragg and Teresa Shea, the Scholarship Committee. And last but not least, Margaret Maurer, Electronic Distribution List and Newsletter Editor. As a reminder, please be aware that the following presentations will be recorded beginning now. And I will now turn it over to Chloe for the Native American statement.
Thanks, Regina. So we wanted to do a quick land acknowledgement. It's a little bit weird since we're meeting virtually, but here we go. Before we start, NOTSL would like to acknowledge the past, present, and future caretakers of this land. Northern Ohio is the ancestral lands of the Delaware, Shawnee, Wyandot, and other Great Lakes tribes. Following the Treaty of Greenville, these people were forcibly removed from this land. We invite you to learn more about the lands that you reside on. One resource for getting started is the Native Lands app, which I will include a link to in the chat. Thank you.
And next, Nathan Freilich will talk to you about the technical specs, the code of conduct, and etc.
Yeah, so we are probably going to have close to 150 participants in this meeting today. So we ask that those not speaking, not use video, and make sure that your mics are muted. We will be recording this session to provide playback for registrants after the event. So if you need access or would like to review the content, we will have that available for you. And again, to help facilitate this, please make sure that your screen share capabilities are off. I will also disable them going forward. And all questions should be put in the chat box and will be monitored by Chloe and myself. If you have any technical issues, please feel free to direct message me at the NOTSL board link here or offline or in the email chat. It's NOTSL board 2020. At Gmail. So that is also live on my screen. So if you have any issues, feel free to get in contact with me.
Well, thank you, Chloe and Nate.
Gina.
After lunch, we'll be holding our business meeting as detailed in the meeting agenda that was emailed to all participants. We have proposed some changes to our bylaws. As attendees, you all are members or considered members and are eligible to vote on those changes. So please take a moment to review them. As a reminder, please be aware the following presentations will be recorded beginning now. The lunch and social portion will not be recorded. Chloe Bragg and Nathan Freilich will serve as our moderators. Our first presenter, Rocky Strader, is Rocky Strader. Rocky is an associate professor in the Bibliographic Initiatives Department of the Ohio State University Libraries. Her functional areas are serving as authorities librarian, catalog maintenance coordinator, and Western languages cataloging coordinator. She supervises and manages the workflows for cataloging in English and Western European languages and oversees creation and processing of name and subject headings, which are contributed to national files maintained by the Library of Congress and the Program for Cooperative Cataloging. Rocky will present about is what it's all about, the state of subject access. Feel free to ask questions during the presentation. And with that, I give you Rocky.
Morning all. Let me take a moment to set up my slides and we'll get started. All right, everyone should be seeing my slides now. And whoops, there we go. Okay, thank you for the introduction. I just want to note my pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I would like to take a moment right now to thank NOTSL for inviting me to present About is What It's About, the State of Subject Access. This presentation is a reprise of the session I did in the spring for the Ohio Valley Tech Group of Technical Services Librarians 2021 virtual conference. That presentation was recorded and was followed by a very brief live Q&A period. Because I was asked to repeat that talk, I'll be reading from the script that I previously used so I don't miss anything. However, there are a few things that weren't in place in the spring that I'll note verbally at the proper times. The slides used in this presentation are mainly guideposts through this overview of the state of subject access. So with that, let's get started. Here's an outline of today's talk. I'll set the stage by talking about subject analysis and subject access broadly, and then define about and aboutness. I'll discuss the different types of subject terms, which include controlled vocabularies, keywords, natural language, and facets, and touch on the advantages and disadvantages of each of these types for expressing aboutness. I'll also talk a little bit about the IFLA Library Reference Model. IFLA stands for International Federation of Library Associations and Institutions. I'll refer to the model as LRM. And I'll also talk very briefly about resource description and access, RDA, the current standard for bibliographic description. Then I'll cover issues related to ethics, diversity, equity, and inclusion and social justice. These are very much at the forefront these days in the wake of protests against targeting and police brutality and the murders of several men of color, as well as immigration and undocumented immigrants, such as the controversy about the Library of Congress subject heading illegal aliens, which has been an issue actually for a few years now. I'll wrap up by talking about opportunities to participate in conversations about subject access with a brief description of my experience as co-chair of the Subject Analysis Committee, which at the time was in the Cataloging and Metadata Management section of ALEX, the Association for Library Collections and Technical Services, and is now part of the Metadata and Collections section of CORE Leadership Infrastructures Futures, a division of the American Library Association. Along the way, I'll pause periodically to address questions. Please feel free to put your questions in the chat and I'll cover what I can as time permits. And I need to make one adjustment. One moment, please. Okay. All right. Okay, first, a general overview of what I mean by subject analysis and subject access. Subject analysis is the act of determining the topic of the resource being described. In the realm of bibliographic description, it is not part of the actual physical description itself, which is really a carrier of content. Subject analysis is performed in relation to the content and leads to subject access, providing the means to discover a resource by assigned subject terms. Subject access is the intended outcome of subject analysis. In more informal parlance, it answers the question, what is it about? Which I'll get to in a few moments. Assigned subject terms are called subject access points in current cataloging practices, although still occasionally called by their previous label, subject headings. Subject analysis is part of so-called authority work, which includes identifying and standardizing terms so that resources can be grouped like with like and to keep track of changing terminology over time. We'll cover this a bit more when I get to controlled vocabularies. about. Let's move on to that question. What is it about? And define about. If you look at a dictionary for a definition of about, you'll find that there are quite a few. It turns out that about can be an adverb, adjective, or preposition. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, OED, as an adverb, about refers to motion or direction. It can also express an approximation, sort of a synonym to nearly. As a preposition, about can express position, especially around something or close to something. But for our purposes, the OED definitions, these are the most relevant. Concerning, regarding, with regard to, in reference to, in the matter of, and further, to have as subject matter, to be concerned with. The Cambridge English Dictionary and Merriam-Webster dictionaries agree. From Cambridge, the most common meaning of about as a preposition is on the subject of or connected with. From Merriam-Webster, as a preposition, it means with regard to, concerned with, fundamentally concerned with or directed toward. What we should notice with these definitions is that about does not and cannot occur in isolation. It is always in relationship with some context, whether it's location, time, or another thing. And that is actually precisely the point of subject analysis, to provide a means of collocating the content of a resource with like materials, that is, placing a resource within the context of and in proximity to other resources that have content that's been identified as similar. This book, recording webpage, talks about the same topic, person, place, thing, idea as that book recording webpage. In physical space, that might mean books with similar content are placed on the same shelf. In digital space, that might mean appearing on the same results page in a search engine or a library catalog. I'd like to take a moment to discuss two related concepts, is and of, because in the past, these have been conflated in subject access terminologies, especially in Library of Congress subject headings, and have only recently been sorted out into separate facets and terminologies, which I'll get to in a few minutes. Is, or you might say the isness of a work, has to do with what the physical or digital existence of the work, often referred to as form or genre. For example, excuse me, an exhibition catalog or scores and parts. In MARC coding for Library of Congress subject headings, these are often preceded by subfield V. Of, or you might say the ofness of a work, has to do with information that is being depicted, but not necessarily deemed to be the topic of the work. This is often an issue with visual materials. For example, the location of a film may be used as a search term by a user, but the location would not be what the film is about. This may or may not be captured in subject analysis. And I'll take this as a chance for any questions. I don't see any at the moment. If anything occurs to you, please feel free to put it in the chat. And I'll move on now to the next slide here. So that was a very quick treatment of about and is and of. I'd like to move on to issues around the terminologies we can use to express those and the advantages and disadvantages to the various approaches. Terminologies generally fall into these buckets: controlled vocabularies, keywords, natural language, and facets. What are the main differences between these? Controlled vocabularies are standardized lists of terms, whereas keywords and natural language are not. Facets sort of sit in between. So let me go into a little bit of depth with these. So, controlled vocabularies. These are standardized lists that prescribe a particular term for use in bibliographic records. That term can then be used to bring together all the materials in the catalog that have that term. A single term is selected as the standard term, and synonyms and similar or related terms are cross-referenced to the standard. This allows for differences in terminologies that develop over time, or that may exist even between locations. For example, do you drink soda or pop? Do you take a sip from a water fountain, drinking fountain, or bubbler? Let's just sit with that for a moment. So this slide shows some examples of controlled vocabularies. Some that are maintained by Library of Congress include LCSH, the Library of Congress subject headings, LCGFT, Library of Congress genre form terms for library and archival materials, and LCMPT, Library of Congress medium of performance thesaurus for music. The National Library of Medicine maintains MESH, medical subject headings. The Getty Research Institute maintains AAT, the Art and Architecture Thesaurus. And OCLC Bilton maintains FAST, Faceted Application of Subject Terminology. This is by no means an exhaustive list of controlled vocabularies that are out there, but these are the ones that are probably the most commonly encountered in bibliographic records that are shared amongst many catalogs. The main problem with controlled vocabularies is that they require a lot of care and feeding to maintain. Updates to terms are often slow to develop. Keywords. Keywords are individual terms or short phrases used as subjects, but they are not kept in a formal list and are not cross-referenced with similar terms or synonyms. Keywords are often words that are taken directly from the resource that's being cataloged or from the field of or discipline that the item belongs in. Keywords may even be assigned by the authors of the works themselves. For example, this happens in the OhioLink ETD Center, the Electronic Thesis and Dissertation Center, in which the thesis or dissertation author is asked to provide keywords when the document is submitted. Those terms become part of the metadata assigned to the document's entry in the database. At Ohio State, those author-assigned keywords are usually added to the bibliographic record in an uncontrolled 653 field. So in this regard, keywords are nearly always up to date with the item and can allow for a considerable amount of nuance. The downside is that there's no cross-referencing with older or related terms, and so the resource very likely will not get pulled into lists of similar or related materials. So say a piece about carbonated beverages gets the keyword pop. What are the chances that an interested soda drinker will find it without a cross-reference to soda or vice versa? Natural language. Natural language, in a sense, is keywords on a larger scale and with more of a cognitive or conceptual emphasis. It is more often thought of in relation to internet search engines than library catalogs. Search engines have the computational oomph to analyze whole sentences or questions that catalogs generally aren't set up for. Nevertheless, it's worth noting, as discovery layers on catalogs are being built out and evolving to handle complex queries, excuse me, they are being built out. In the current cataloging environment, meaning MARC records, natural language terms are not accommodated at that level. However, with discovery and search engine type layers, keywords and controlled terms can feed into those structures. It may be that when the cataloging environment finally leaves MARC and lands in the linked data world, the treatment of terminologies may open up into more natural language, or not. Some may argue that we'll still need disambiguation pages, such as those that are used by Wikipedia, for a long time, if not forever. There will probably always be a need for that "did you mean" prompt. Facets. Facets are as I said, are sort of in between controlled vocabularies and keywords or natural language. They occupy a space that is sometimes hierarchical and at other times more broadly relational. The structure provided by facets means that the user can post-coordinate strings of terms to drill down in search results instead of relying on pre-coordinated or pre-built strings in a controlled vocabulary that aren't necessarily intuitive or up to date with current terms in a research area. FAST and MESH are examples of faceted controlled vocabularies. WorldCat.org is a faceted display. So is Amazon.com for that matter. The example on this slide, sorry, it's kind of small, is the WorldCat.org list for a subject search on carbonated beverages. And again, my apologies for the small size of the text. I've collapsed the format facet in order to show a bit more of the other facets that are available from the records gathered by this search. Format includes article, image, archival material, book, and so on. The facets shown are author, year, language, content, which is what we call former genre. In this example, fiction and nonfiction were captured. There is a third one for biography. Not captured in this screenshot are audience, juvenile or non-juvenile, and topic, which are broad at this level, but drill into more specific headings once one of the links is selected. Okay, I'll stop right here. Look briefly at the chat. Tags would be another word. Yes, those are generally considered keywords. Wisconsin bubbler, yes. And pop, yes, as a music genre. So there's also that issue of disambiguation that could occur with the same word used in different contexts. So thank you for bringing those up. Right, I'll move on. So to discuss briefly the IFLA library reference model in RDA. I'll admit there's very little here to discuss, but I would be remiss not to mention these given that LRM is the conceptual basis for the current cataloging standard, that is RDA. Subjects as subjects are not addressed in either of them. Let me expand just a wee bit. The LRM supersedes three previous entity relationship models. FRBR, the functional requirements of bibliographic records, FRAD, functional requirements of authority data, and FRSAD, functional requirements for subject authority data. FRBR enumerated three groups of entities. Group one, which most of us are familiar with, work, expression, manifestation, item. You might say the products of creative effort. Group two, person, family, corporate body. In other words, the agent that is responsible for the creative effort. And group three, subjects of group one or group two's creative effort, including concepts, object, events, and places. To oversimplify, since it would be easy to go out of scope for this presentation, FRAD expanded on the relationships between group two entities, which are basically names that would go into the name authority file. FRSAD expanded on group three entities, aka subjects. And in a nutshell, LRM took most of FRBR, a chunk of FRAD, and only a tiny bit of FRSAD. In general, however, LRM dropped group three entities, that is subjects, as a separate category of relationship. The implications for this are apparent in RDA. Subject entities, or at least subject type entities, beyond time span and place are not included. Concepts related to subject access are limited to minimum requirements for uniqueness or a one-to-one relationship between a label and that which is being labeled. That's probably clear as mud, but the upshot is the subject of subjects is not part of RDA, our current cataloging standard. I'll move on now to ethics. I'll move on to the current broader landscape of subject analysis and subject access, and that is ethics, diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice. For this discussion, I'll touch on immigration status, race, gender, and indigenous and native populations. Illegal aliens. One of the first issues along these lines came to the forefront several years ago with the controversy over the Library of Congress subject heading, illegal aliens. In 2014 at Dartmouth College, students there called for the Dartmouth College libraries to stop using the term illegal aliens, and especially to replace illegal with undocumented. They worked with one of the librarians to submit proposals to Library of Congress through the Subject Authority Cooperative Program, SACO, to change Library of Congress subject headings that use the term illegal aliens. The proposals were rejected. This was just the beginning of a series of proposals, resolutions, and counter-resolutions, even to the point of Congress getting involved. 2 reports were issued by the Subject Analysis Committee and ALA. The first, report from the SAC Working Group on LCSH Illegal Aliens, was issued in July 2016. The controversy is documented in greater detail in the second report, which was released in June 2020, report of the SAC Working Group on Alternatives to LCSH Illegal Aliens. In between the 2 reports, a video documentary history from the Dartmouth students' perspective was released in 2019, titled Change the Subject. In November 2020, the Database Improvement and Discoverability Policy team at OhioLink released its own documentation, the Guidelines for Addressing Outdated or Offensive Subject Terms, based on the June 2020 SAC report that I just mentioned. The illegal aliens issue is an ongoing example of the problem that I noted earlier about controlled vocabularies. They take a while to catch up to current acceptable usage. In what may be considered to be typical cases, tangible occurrences like in books, articles, and so on lag way behind the usage in the field or discipline. And I'll note an update here. Last Friday, November 12th, 2021, Library of Congress announced that it would be updating this term and the term aliens. Illegal aliens will be covered by non-citizens and illegal immigration. As you may note, it still does not solve the illegal terminology portion of this. And there are discussions ongoing in several email forums that I have not updated the slides with, so my apologies for that. So, all right, I'll continue. An example of the evolution across many decades of written works, an example of this very type of issue besides illegal aliens is from various written works of the terms Negroes, colored people, Afro-Americans, Blacks, Black Americans, and African Americans. So, and that's mostly that is usage and culture. In other cases, like illegal aliens, the political environment holds back the term's evolution in controlled vocabularies, even though when the literature and usage in a field has moved away from the term. So this current slide, it is the current LCSH for African Americans. Okay. Toward remediation. Although reporting out these issues can be very uncomfortable, and it should be, it is important to note that what I'm presenting today also carries quite a bit of hope. Efforts at remediation of terms in their application are being made and show no signs of stopping. One example of such remediation and guidance on race-sensitive cataloging may be found at the Archives for Black Lives in Philadelphia, which has an extensive guide and annotated list of what they call anti-racist description resources. Race and immigration status are not the only ethical or social justice concerns within the sphere of subject terminologies. There are also gender-related biases evident within systems like LCSH. For example, authors versus women authors, in which maleness is assumed for the first term and women are explicitly called out in the latter. One would ask, shouldn't it be men authors and women authors? Or maybe better yet, just authors and no women authors as a heading at all? If gender identification is important for searching, there may be other ways to bring that out. This is an issue that has received some discussion, but still needs to be more fully addressed. LGBTQ sensitive vocabularies are also being developed. For example, homosaurus.org, which is a linked data vocabulary. There are also concerns and some remediation beginning to happen around how Native populations are described and referred to. For example, Libraries and Archives Canada is actively focusing on respectful work with materials by and about individuals and groups in the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis Nation. Library of Congress and LCSH have a long way to go to catch up on this front as well. An excellent blog post dated November 19th, 2020 from the University of Texas Arlington Libraries delineates the problem with LCSH. It's by Stephanie Luke entitled Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in Metadata Practices, the example of Joe Mora's Indians of North America. There are many, many other examples of bias in cataloging and subject access. This is merely an introduction. We have a long way to go to remediate records and equitably treat underrepresented individuals, groups, and topics. And I'll take this moment to check the chat.
Hey, Rocky, we do have a
Yes.
question in the chat that I'm just going to read out
Yes, please.
for accessibility. So if you use Summon/Alma, have you experienced outdated subjects being imported along with content? I found titles with those former descriptions of African Americans, and it got reported up the chain and became a ticket with Ex Libris. It's a garbage in, garbage out situation.
It looks like there's an addendum.
Yeah,
to the
there's
content.
content from libraries that have not updated their subjects that was imported into their discovery layer.
Okay. We don't use Summon or Alma. Ohio State is an innovative catalog. So I can't address that specifically, but yes, it is garbage in, garbage out. If it's in there, and that's part of what I do with catalog maintenance and that type of thing, is that it's quality control partly. But we're also constrained. We're also a PCC library, so we have to still follow, the rules, as it were, in order to provide records that comply with PCC. And then on occasion, we will adjust locally. That's about the only thing that we can do right now. So I'm sorry I can't give you a better answer to that, but it's very much, yeah, it is an ongoing problem, regardless of platform.
And then we also have a question related to the women authors. Is women authors biased? What if the user is looking for works by female writers?
It's biased because of its context, because it's opposite for male writers is only covered by the generic term authors, and that's where the bias occurs. If we really wanted to even it out, as it were, and make it truly equitable, the generic authors would not assume maleness. You would still have a men authors cognate to the women authors. That's where the bias occurs. It's because there's an assumption of male first by dropping the qualifier. I hope that answers the question. So out of context, it's not biased at all. It's merely descriptive. But if you don't have that cognate men authors, then you've introduced bias into the system. Okay. All right, I'm going to move on. Opportunities for participation. So if you are interested in participating in conversations around subject access, and I hope you are, I'd like to bring your attention back around to two entities that I've referred to in this presentation. SACO, the Subject Authority Cooperative Program, which is part of the Program for Cooperative Cataloging, PCC, and the Subject Analysis Committee. SACO. SACO is a branch of the Program for Cooperative Cataloging, as I mentioned, which allows member institutions to submit proposals for LCSH, as well as LC genre form terms, LCGFT, demographic group terms, LCDGT, and medium of performance thesaurus for music, LCMPT, as well as to the Library of Congress classification schedules. In other words, call numbers, class numbers. For those whose library may not be a member of the PCC, there are also the so-called SACO funnels, where a member institution coordinates contributions from multiple institutions who may or may not be members of the PCC. The Subject Analysis Committee is a committee in the metadata and collection section of core leadership infrastructures and futures. I was a member of in 2015 through 2017, and then co-chair of the committee 2017 through 2019, when it was still part of the Association for Library Collections and Technical Services, which has been superseded by CORE. Prior to my membership on the committee, I attended the meetings for a number of years and heard the discussions of various concerns, including illegal aliens. In addition to its voting members, SAC has a number of liaisons from various organizations who fully participate in the discussion around subject analysis and subject access. And they do very actively contribute, which is appreciated. Representation falls into two categories: organizations that produce and maintain standards and vocabularies, and organizations that work in a specific discipline. So the committee has representatives from American Association of Law Libraries, Art Libraries Society of North America, the Getty Vocabulary Program, IFLA, Library of Congress, representing LCSH and children's subject headings, Music Library Association, the National Library of Medicine, OCLC, Online Audiovisual Catalogers, and PCC. The committee also has a subcommittee on faceted vocabularies and the Illegal Aliens Working Group. Before the pandemic, the committee met twice a year at midwinter and annual meetings of the American Library Association, but also conducted quite a bit of business by email. Obviously, it is a very large group to manage, but it is made up of people who are dedicated to the work of subject access. While I was co-chair, the lack of music movement on the illegal aliens issue prompted the creation of the current Illegal Aliens Working Group, which produced this report after I rotated off the committee. However, I am now back on this committee. Late this summer, I accepted a new appointment as chair of SAC through June of next year, 2022. Just can't stay away, I guess. I'd also like to take this opportunity to point to two other groups within CORE that provide opportunities for discussion about subject access. The Authority Control Interest Group, which covers all aspects of authority control, not just subjects, and the Faceted Subject Access Interest Group, which discusses the applications of facets in subject terminology, especially in relation to digital projects, including but not limited to FAST, Art and Architecture Thesaurus, and LCGFT. So this has been a very quick overview of the state of subject access. I thank you for your time, and we'll take some more questions. If you'd like to contact me for further discussion, please feel free to email me at strader.2@osu.edu. So thank you. And questions? Looks like there's some more.
Rocky. We did have a follow-up question about women authors, and then there were some comments in the chat that I'll read out, and then if you have anything to add, feel free.
Okay.
So the question asker asked, how then do you find works by women authors? And then some of the responses in the chat were, I think that's part of the problem. Women authors is very useful for people looking for women authors, but by using the term, we further other women authors. It's the same with women artists and scientists. There was another comment that removal of bias surrounding women. LCSH requires the establishment of parallel male LCSH. This is the case for some headings, but it's not equal yet.
Mm-hmm. And that's really where we would need to get at those differences, because yes, and there are times when you want to drill down, this doesn't take away gender as an important aspect of research or even looking for things for your own use. It's just that we need to take out the assumption that we need, or let me rephrase that, we need parallel constructions. so that if we're going to use author, then it can mean anybody. And women authors, yes, women authors. So there should be, if I'm going to look for a male author, I need men authors, not just authors. So it isn't a matter of taking anything away from description. If anything, it's with explicitly providing more context and relationship around things that have tended to be assumed male first. And so men authors, women authors, men scientists, women scientists. And those would all be narrower terms of scientists, or in the previous case, authors. So it's really a matter of being explicit about our specificity, if that makes sense. Okay.
Thanks, Rocky. I see some other comments in the chat about that, but we do have a different question.
Okay.
Is there a way to see what proposals SACO has turned down? We have some ideas to suggest, but we don't want to repeat the work.
They do issue follow-up. There's you may trying to remember all the different email channels that they do this with. SACO program will send out tentative lists, and then there are follow-up after the meetings. There's the results of the meetings, and those are the results where they say that they turned down a proposal or ask for it to be resubmitted with certain additional information or that sort of thing. Let me make a note so that I can follow up with you on what lists that
like
those tend to be, unless someone's put it in, because I can't see the whole
folks
chat.
have put it in the chat, so thank you.
It's way down from Rebecca, the LOC. Yeah, thank you. All right, I won't need to do that. But yeah, the results are posted. So thank you, Rebecca, for putting that in the chat.
And it looks like there's just more conversation about assuming that white men are default in LCSH.
Yeah.
There's also some comments on issues of gender identity.
Yeah, if I may interrupt, I see Aaron made a note. Another issue with having women and men LCSH, what about those that identify as non-binary? That is a conversation that is just getting started, and it definitely does need to be addressed. And I figure there will be more guidance coming, but as I noted before, the wheels, they do turn slow. But it's definitely something, and it's the type of thing that can, speaking as the chair of SAC, it's the type of thing to bring up. So if, it's there, and it can come up on email lists. All of us are on multiple lists, and we want to see these things surface so that we can address them. There's another comment, the current subject headings assume both gender and race. Authors are assumed to be white men. That is a very good point too. And that still there needs to be cognate adjustments on that front as well. All right. Chloe, are there any other things popping out to you? Thank you so much for the participation, folks.
I don't see any further questions. So if anyone has any questions, please type them into the chat.
Katie makes a good point to Aaron. Should we use women and female and also other gender and sex designations? Also, do we always know gender or sex of authors by name or bio blurb? No. And it's always I consider it a very touchy issue as to whether I have the right to make an assumption from what I read, to include, whether or not to include that information in a person's authority record. If it's, some people try to go digging for it. If they haven't presented themselves in a particular way, I personally make no assumptions and I don't add that field in the authority record. I think it's a matter of cataloger judgment on that, but always with an eye toward respecting the appearance or not of a person's preferred identity in published materials. Okay, and Violet also put the link in. Thank you. And
It looks like we
librarians,
do
yes.
have some questions. Couldn't these descriptors be added to the name authority so that if there are changes, the works change automatically?
Anything that can be automated is much. Where is that? I'm trying to
Down
find
towards
it.
the bottom.
Let's see. Except bottom keeps changing.
Yeah, I know.
Who asked? Who made the comment, please?
Bonnie?
Where is it? There it could. There we go. Yeah. Ideally, that is exactly what happens with, I finally found it. Couldn't these descriptors be added to the name authority so that if there are changes, the works change automatically? Technically, yes, but sometimes if they're, depending on the kind of change that's made at the preference of the author or creator, however you want to designate their type of creative effort, they may also change their name, and they've changed. When a person does change their identity like that, it's very often a full change. I had a student who is trans, and he was gracious enough to explain one time how it's a change in their identity. And it can't always be covered in just one authority record. We want to express relationships, and sometimes that means a brand new authority record, and we make a relationship connection between the previous identity and the current identity. So it's a very tricky thing to navigate, and maybe the linked data environment will help that. We'll just have to wait and see. I hope so. Because the world is a lot more complex than our records depict, to say the least.
There's another question about using facet vocabularies to act as a supplement to subject vocabularies to deal with the women authors issue. Would you use a facet to mention that a woman is an author?
In the current market environment, the facets kind of have to be built in. They don't exist separately from the record, so they have to be brought into the record. So that's partly an issue of the way that the system and its individual parts are designed. So it would have to be in the record somehow, and it's not really a supplement at that point. Kind of hard to get into without having a MARC record up to point to. Yes, it's all a work in progress.
Mm-hmm. There was a
Thank
question
you, Amanda,
about
Rob.
The issue with using data in name authority records is that many catalogs and discovery tools don't use that data yet. Mm-hmm. Is this something we need to push vendors to put in the public UI?
I'm going to disagree a little bit with that, because even in some, several of us have had the experience of being asked to take some of that data out by the people themselves. Yeah, where we have a record for someone who's still alive. We've had we've had people ask, take the dates out of my heading. I can imagine for the parts that aren't public yet, once those become visible, there may be some people saying, I don't want myself identified that way publicly. Or so closely that it becomes part of how they're thought about in a context that's not directly related to their gender or other type of identity. So that is a cultural piece that has not really been addressed yet. So I'm not sure that, in a way, I'm not sure that people are ready for that. I'm speaking for myself, not for SAC or anybody else. That's just my view on it right now. But it's definitely worth having those conversations to see where those things can at least be enabled, and if nothing else, to be turned on or off, depending on an institution's or other users' context as to whether that information is publicly available.
There's another question. Oh, I'm
Uh,
sorry.
I see Margaret's question about vendor representatives on SAC. They're not representing their companies, but we do have people who participate from vendors. For example, my vice chair on SAC is from Marchive. And another person that I regularly sat with before I finally got onto SAC years ago is at Backstage Library Works. So they do attend and there's been other people from other places, other vendors that come on a semi-regular basis. So yes, they are there. They are invited. It's their personal choice, the level of participation that they make on SAC. So yes, they are certainly not excluded, and we welcome them at the table.
There have been some questions. One was about, don't we need to recognize the gender, race, etc. of a particular resource, like piano music by Black composers? And there was a similar question, if a collection consists of just male authors but doesn't necessarily identify itself as such, should we use male authors?
That is a good question, and I'm not going to be prescriptive. I think like the piano by Black composers, if they're publicly identified or in the published material, or otherwise we know about the composers who did that, then if it's recorded, then not recorded, published, then yes. I mean, it's a data point that's available. We don't want these things to be invisible, but we need to respect what level of visibility, at least that our living authors and creators have, at the type of exposure or the type of publicity that they expect for the work that they do. If some scientists, women, Black, white, male, whatever, for example, they want to be, I think some of them want to be scientists first. The ones who are activists, they're going to say that they're going to be activist about it. But it's not up to us to assume that. And that's, I'm a big fan of, let's talk to the people. If there's a way to talk to the people that we're collecting, that we're describing their stuff, I'm not above making a phone call to somebody. I've done that in my authority work in the past, a phone call or an email. Have this, can you clarify for me? I would like to put this in your record. Is that okay? And sometimes it's yes, and sometimes it's no. And it's up to us to respect that. Where it's people who are gone, what's available in the reference literature, what is known about them in the history of the discipline of whatever it is that it sits in, history and music, for example. We have resources, and we should not be making assumptions, and we need to be a little more assertive in saying, I'd like some more information about you or whatever you produced, or that type of thing, instead of just sitting at our desks and looking at the piece in hand and say, okay, what do I do with this? I know I'm oversimplifying it, and I might even be a little pugnacious about it, but we need to get out there and talk to folks who are creating this stuff and not making assumptions about what comes across our desk. It's okay to get up and ask. I think we don't do enough of that.
I think we have time for one more question. How do the MARC 386 tags, creator, contributor characteristics fit in? I see them in OCLC records, but I don't know how or where they're intended to be accessed or used.
Let's see, these are in bib records. 386.
Yes.
I am, quite frankly, I hate that tag in a bib record. A creator characteristic belongs in that individual's authority record. It does not belong in a description of the piece itself. And that's one of the problems actually that linked data would solve, because those relationships are already would be more surfaceable from the interplay of authority information with bibliographic information. In the way that linked data works. To brute force the 386, I'm sorry, I see a creator character. I actually saw a record for, what was it? I think Finlandia or something like that. And it said male. I was like, I'm sorry, this piece is not male. You know, Sibelius is male. The person who wrote it is male, but the piece is not male. And I think it was ill-advised for that tag to ever exist in a bib record. That's how I feel about that. So so yeah, their intent for it is very odd to me, because it belongs with the creator, not with the piece. Okay, let's see, Dago cataloger. Oh, it's just a comment. Okay. Seems to me that I saw a question fly by and now I can't find it. I'm sorry. Yes, Phyllis from Overland. We need to make a clear distinction here between authority record entity attributes on the one hand and subject access points in the bib record on the other. Very well said. Thank you.
I think we're about out of time here.
We do have
Okay.
some more time.
Okay, this is a great,
11:15.
yeah. Oh yeah, we have a few more minutes. This is a fantastic conversation, folks. Thank you very much for your comments and questions. And I hope we managed to catch all of the questions to be able to answer them. I'm looking forward to getting a transcript of the chat back so that I can go through it again. How do people make suggestions for new headings? Those go through the proposal process, and you need to be a member of SACO in order to participate in that. We have special sort of a bit of a backside access to classification web that allows us to submit proposals for review. So you can, if you have a suggestion and you're not a member of SACO, you can send the proposal suggestion for a term. Violet says you don't need to be a SACO member, but there needs to, isn't there once upon a time there was a form at LC that that people could fill out, and it would go that way. If you don't have to be a SACO member, but the easy way is find a SACO person or a funnel, and in those links that I provided. And actually, I forgot to ask Notsul, do you need my slides, and where would you put them? Yeah, the funnels are a great way for non-SACO folks to contribute as well. And that, by the way, having the funnels facilitates conversation between folks so that we know what's going on in various parts of the country and states and other institutions. Yes, thank you, Violet. Violet has put the list in for the non-SACO, the URL in for non-SACO members.
So Rocky, we generally will ask for your slides after your presentation because a lot of times they'll go through them and they're find edits or things that they want to take in or out. So you can feel free to send those over to either myself or Laura, and we'll really house those on the website for a little bit of time.
Okay, thank you. I'll get that turned around in the next few days. How many suggestions a group like SACO gets? Dozens, hundreds? A lot. I'm not privy to the backside of it. That's all handled by Library of Congress, but it's a lot. You can kind of get a sense of that from the tentative lists that are posted to Library of Congress's website. I know it's at least in the dozens. I think depending on what might come through that gets to be a hot topic, it can be hundreds. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Thanks, Violet. Yeah, but it's a lot. And it's a very small group at LC that handles these. Other questions? All right, then. Yes, the LC does require a certain amount of research and support for a given proposal, such as the source that's being used that generated the notion that the subject heading is needed, and occasionally at least some other kind of disciplinary support that can show that the term is in common usage or is getting to be the accepted terminology in a discipline. You're welcome, and thank you, Katie. All right, I'm going to stop share. Yep. And turn things back over to Notsul. Thank you so much, everybody. It's been a great to meet with you and to present on this and to see your questions and comments. We got to keep the conversation going. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Rocky. We'll now take a short break. The next speaker will start at 11:30, and the Zoom room will remain open in case anybody wants to discuss, socialize, but it will not be recorded.
artists. The project began nearly 2 years ago and has since developed into exploration of a broader range of inappropriate, inaccurate, or inadequate Library of Congress subject headings for underrepresented communities. We began thinking about music description outside the Western musical canon after becoming involved in a project to develop respectful and accurate descriptors for undocumented immigrants in the United States, which had been proposed to the Library of Congress but had not been adopted. This resulted in the introduction of 7 alternative subject headings to enable searches using appropriate language. As music catalogers who work with a wide variety of music materials, we decided to undertake descriptions of musical expressions outside the Western canon using language that reflects the quality and specificity of the music described. As we were designing the pilot project to explore what we could do to build an inclusive catalog, we found ourselves working from home in the midst of a pandemic with limited physical access to the materials we planned to work with. Adapting to circumstances required us to build a project scalable to those limitations and to adjust to a more limited pilot than we initially envisioned. We collaborated remotely to create a short list of CDs in our collection that were described as world music. While the tag world music is useful in specific contexts, it has also been applied as a blanket term when information about the music described was not extant in the Library of Congress subject headings, or when little was known by the cataloger about the music. Today, you'll hear Kelsey describe her extensive work on identifying inappropriate usage of the term world music, as well as subject headings for Indigenous peoples that employ the blanket descriptor Indians for the whole of Indigenous peoples in the Americas. Linda will detail our continuing project work to expand opportunities for improving access to works of underrepresented communities, providing data, outcomes, and a look ahead.
I tried a few different methods to explore how the subject heading world music was being used in the catalog to describe sound recordings. Between the CD collections housed in the Waltz Music Library and our off-site storage facility, 65 CDs have been cataloged with the world music subject heading. I first went through each of the records and determined the geographic area or ethnic groups represented in the music, the home source of each genre, instrument, or music tradition, with the goal of determining where our examples of world music were coming from to see if there were any geographical correlations. These were then plotted on a map, as you can see here. Because many of these CDs were compilations featuring artists and styles from multiple places, our map ended up with significantly more than 65 pins. Within some areas, I tried to account for specific ethnic groups. Tuva in Russia, for example, Indigenous peoples in North America and Australia, as well as diasporic communities such as the Jewish populations around the world. While far from flawless, this illustrated that the term world music had in fact been used to reflect music from just about everywhere. Of course, we are probably not surprised to see that the African continent was most represented with 70 pins by this subject heading. But Western Europe is, perhaps unexpectedly for anyone who has ever looked in the world music section of a record store, a far second with 44 examples. So in terms of ethnic or racial othering, or Orientalism as it was called by Edward Said, this at first seemed rather promising to those of us who expected world music to reflect the colonial gaze of Western Europe and the US by extension, looking outside of itself. However, the picture became more complicated when I started looking at how, instead of just where, the subject heading was being used. Linda and Clara suggested that I examine each bibliographic record and divide the samples into the following categories: compilations in which 6 or more musics or groups were represented, compilations with 5 or less discrete music forms, CDs accompanying instructional material, such as ethnomusicology textbooks and films, and then the final category, CDs that were actually not world music. So then let me back up and explain the definition I used to determine if a CD contained world music. My concept of what world music is has been informed by literature in ethnomusicology that strives to answer this question as well as to characterize the effects and consequences to local music traditions due to the increasingly global, digital, mainstreamed, and popular music market. So scholars such as Philip Bowman, Stephen Feld, Jocelyn Guilbeault, Jennifer Post, Ruth Stone, and Timothy Taylor have written extensively about world music as a concept, a construct, a label, and an ever-changing phenomenon. So here I must also acknowledge that some of the records I examined were cataloged in the early 1990s. But because our catalog is by nature dynamic, constantly adding records of materials of various ages, I'm trying to use a definition that works for today. So world music implies an international, transnational blending of folk and popular music from disparate geographies and traditions, marketed for geographically distant audiences. So CDs were marked as appropriate usage of the term when, firstly, the CD had either compilations or fusions of multiple genres associated with different geographies, ethnic groups, and styles. So our example here is Africa to Appalachia, a collaboration between Jamie Stone and Mansa Sissoko, which puts the American banjo music back into conversation with its transatlantic African roots in Mali. And secondly, it was considered appropriate when there was evidence of global popular music idioms, for example, jazz, rap, or rock, to be used in conjunction with folk music to globalize music styles and make local traditions sound more familiar and palatable to the global music market. But it was not considered appropriate when a popular music originates in a single location and more or less remains specific to that place, because this would essentially, to do otherwise, would give the West credit for all popular music. So Cuban son from a group like the Buena Vista Social Club is Cuban music, not world music. But a collaboration between Angelique Kidjo and various US pop stars and instrumentalists, which draws on several Nigerian and North American music traditions, can safely be called world music. Materials were flagged as inappropriate use of the subject heading when, for example, world music was used as a non-specific at best or Orientalist at worst synonym for non-Western, and was superfluous given the presence of more specific subject headings, such as when the CD only had music of one ethnic group, one genre, one instrument. Our example here is a CD of only traditional Qing music from China. This is more accurately cataloged as Chinese folk music, not world music. It was also inappropriate when world music and or folk music often appeared together when these were used without any geographic subdivisions. Perhaps this is technically correct, especially when many subject headings would be necessary to complete the record. But it's not really that helpful for searching or identifying content in the catalog. So some of these Linda and Clara will be able to fix. However, some others will have to wait until we have access to our physical collection again. And finally, I marked CDs as inappropriate when they had a combination of both of those previous two criteria. Something that is not world music and is labeled as world music with no other more specific subject headings. So in other words, it's both wrong and vague. In the process of sorting these records, I also made it a point to look at the other subject headings and identify others that were problematic. Some examples included boleros music, without geographically delineating whether this was the Spanish or the Latin American version. While somewhat related, they are actually not the same dance and music. So a delineation there would be helpful, right? Religious music of South Africa was called popular instead of religious, and some simply specified Africa as a location. Now this is a rather large continent, so were I using the catalog to find research materials, I would be looking for something a lot more specific. The most startling I saw was one that was simply Blacks Morocco, which is not at all a respectful term for the numerous ethnic groups in the nation, never mind its lack of specificity. So before Linda demonstrates what she did to enhance the cataloging of these materials, I wanted to suggest very quickly that this is not an isolated problem limited to a handful of subject headings, but plagues non-Western classical canonic music more deeply. And this is where we see plenty of potential for future research once we are all able to return to our physical libraries. I did another subject heading search for Indians of North America music, And our catalog includes 25 CDs. Of those, genre classifications were added to 5. And proper geographic or ethnic subdivisions, in this case only Cree or Navajo, were only added to 6. The only instruments mentioned in the subject headings were drums and flute, even though the recordings featured a diverse collection of musical styles performed by a diverse group of people sharing a continent. It's not just essentializing to the music and the people who make it, but it's also making our catalog harder to use for ethnomusicological research.
As you can tell, Kelsey did a hefty amount of the legwork on this pilot project for us, and we are very thankful for all of the time and effort that she put into this work to improve our catalog records, especially considering this was all done via remote work, which started basically when the pandemic did in 2020. I will now go into more detail about the process we have used to update records with the subject heading World Music. I will also quickly cover some of our initial findings with the second phase of this project and the subject heading Indians of North America Music. I will give a breakdown of record statistics to help give a fuller picture of what these records looked like, both in our local catalog and in OCLC. Here on this slide, you can see I have an outline of the steps in our workflow, and Kelsey already covered parts of this. I simply wanted to provide a visual overview here before continuing onwards. Our search for headings with world music resulted in 65 sound recordings, including items housed in our music library's closed stacks and items stored in our off-site storage facility. We had Kelsey sort the world music CDs into 4 categories, which you can see in the pie chart on the left. This resulted in 3 CDs that were instructional materials intended for use in a world music class, 20 CDs with 5 or fewer musical traditions represented on them, 22 with more than 6 traditions represented, and 20 records where, based on the definition of world music that we were using, the term appeared to have been applied inappropriately. In other words, approximately 1/3 of the records had an inappropriate usage of world music. For comparison, the right-hand chart represents a similar initial search for Indians of North America music, which we'll discuss in more detail in a little bit. For now, I just wanted to say that the initial search found 78 sound recording records, but I narrowed these results down to 24 records that had only the broad heading Indians of North America music and nothing more specific in terms of Native American music traditions or geographic areas being represented in the subject headings. The pie chart on the right shows what dividing these 24 records into similar categories to world music looked like. This resulted in only 1 record that qualified as instructional materials, 9 records that had 5 or fewer Native American nations music represented on them, 12 records that had 6 or more groups represented, and 2 records where there was not enough information available to determine anything very specific about them. As we'll see later, this analysis helped us determine how many records we could most improve upon by adding more specific subjects. Going back to world music, once we had it narrowed down to these 20 results, I went through the records to determine if I agreed with Kelsey that world music was inappropriately used, and looked to see what improvements we could make. Since we didn't have any access to our physical collections in spring of 2020 due to the ongoing pandemic, any records that we couldn't listen to online or find digital liner notes for had to be put aside. We will deal with these items in a future stage of this project. There were only 6 records that fell into this category. There were 4 records that already had sufficiently specific and descriptive subject headings and where world music was not needed because the recording only represented 1 musical tradition. In nearly all these records, we opted to only remove world music locally and not in the OCLC records. We came to this decision based on the fact that our library supports ethnomusicology research, and that requires much more specific subject access than what world music provides. Furthermore, our CD collection is in our closed stacks and is not browsable, except through the catalog. However, we did reason that world music could conceivably be a helpful heading for other libraries. For instance, a public library that organizes their CD collection into broad browsable categories, possibly including world music as one such category. The final step for our world music pilot project was to go through the remaining 10 records that needed more specific subject headings to replace world music. Clara and I divided up this work between the two of us, so it took hardly any time at all. These updates included adding geographic subdivisions such as Uganda, Mali, and Cuba, as well as adding additional subjects. Some examples of ones that we added include jazz rock and songs Hindi. Then we removed world music once it was a superfluous heading. In OCLC, I found that by and large, the records had already been updated by other catalogers. When I did update an OCLC record, it was to add geographic subdivisions or additional specific subject headings. This chart shows the breakdown of edits to the 20 records that had world music as a subject. There was only one record that we left world music in locally. This was a CD described as Hindi popular music in the record, and world music seemed relatively accurate as this was described as a fusion of Eastern and Western music traditions on the publisher's website. In the chart, you can see that the blue represents the 4 records Kelsey removed world music from for us. Orange is the 6 that we did not have enough information to update under the remote working conditions. And gray is the 9 records that world music was removed from once it became unnecessary, after we had added more specific subjects to those records. Since spring of 2020, we have begun exploring other problematic subject headings. And as I already mentioned, the next phase of this project focused on sound recording records that contained the subject Indians of North America, music, with no more specific subject headings representing Native American nations or geographic locations. There are many issues with the currently available LCSH terms for Native Americans. The most prominent issue being the dominance of the word Indian, which is a colonialist, inaccurate, and frankly, an outdated term that is still used with shocking frequency, particularly in the United States. Unfortunately, I don't really have time to go in depth into all the issues with LCSH terms for Indigenous peoples or related issues with Library of Congress classification. Honestly, someone could do probably multiple presentations on that topic. But I will say that many people have already written about this topic, and I hope that if it interests you, that you will seek more detailed information about it. Libraries and archives in Canada, including ones that use LCSH, have already taken steps to remove the term Indians from their catalogs, preferring terms such as First Nations or the broad Indigenous peoples in their catalog records. It is also more respectful to use the names that Indigenous peoples use to refer to themselves, rather than outdated westernized monikers. For instance, instead of tacking Indians onto every name of every Native American nation, as is done in LCSH, it would be far better to use their preferred name alone. For example, Cheyenne, not Cheyenne Indians. For phase 2 of our sound recording focused project, we took inspiration from a 2018 article by Christine Bone and Brett Lougheed, which outlines changes to LCSH that the Association for Manitoba Archives implemented to better describe archival material about Indigenous peoples in Canada. They chose to implement the broad LCSH term Indigenous peoples with appropriate geographic subdivisions and eliminate problematic headings such as Indians of North America in their records. At CU Boulder, our libraries have taken the stance on other problematic headings, such as the previously mentioned illegal aliens, that as an institution that creates PCC records, we cannot in good conscience remove official LCSH terms from records. But until such time as these subject headings are updated in LCSH, what we can do is add in less offensive terms to our local records, creating and using local vocabulary when necessary. This increases keyword searchability and encourages our users to use more respectful terminology to search in the catalog, instead of requiring us to direct them to use offensive language. In this case, Clara and I are opting to add the broad subject heading Indigenous Peoples, North America, Music to our sound recording records that feature the problematic Indians of North America music. As with the world music subject, whenever it was practical to add more specific subject headings to these records, we have done so. However, for now, we are still using LCSH terms that include the word Indians, as we hope that someday LCSH will change these headings to more appropriate terms and they can be updated en masse at that time. In the meantime, we plan on exploring the possibility of adding less offensive names to our local records from vocabularies outside LCSH, possibly from the Mashantucket Pequot Thesaurus or the First Nations House of Learning subject headings. This next chart shows the breakdown of edits we did for the 24 records with Indians of North America, music, and no more specific subject headings. In all of these records, we added the term Indigenous Peoples, North America music as an alternative subject. There were 11 records where we were able to add more specific headings for Native American nations and/or more specific geographic subdivisions. There were 7 records that had music from over 5 different Native American nations, and there were 6 records where we did not have enough information to add anything more specific and only added the Indigenous Peoples, North America music subject heading. I will also note here that with these records, unlike the world music records, a lot more of these were old LP catalog records that had not been updated in OCLC. So for the records that we did add more specific subjects to, those edits were done in both OCLC as well as our local records. Only a handful of the newer CD records had better and more specific headings already added to them in OCLC. Let's take a look at a couple quick examples of records that we updated. The first example I have here is a recording by Mamadou Diabate. This was a record where the OCLC record had already been updated with more specific headings for folk music, Mali, and I left headings for popular instrumental music and world music in the OCLC record, but removed them from our local catalog because they are so incredibly broad. Locally, I added the missing geographic subdivision for Mali to folk music and also added the heading for Mandingo, African people, Mali music. The second example I have is a CD of Cree round dance songs performed by the Northern Cree singers. Our local record only had Indians of North America music and powwow songs for subject headings. However, this was one of the few records where the OCLC record had been updated by someone already and had more specific headings. These included songs, Cree Indians, music, and dance music. So we added all of these terms to our local record, as well as added Indigenous Peoples, Canada, music, and Canada as geographic subdivision to both dance music and powwow songs. To finish up here, I will briefly outline our plans for expanding this project. We hope that our next steps will include expanding searches from just sound recordings to including scores. We expect that world music will hardly be an issue with scores and that Indians of North America music will be an issue, but likely with a smaller number of records to address than with the sound recordings. We plan to further pursue the possibility of using terms from other vocabularies, such as the previously mentioned Mashantucket Pequot Thesaurus and the First Nations House of Learning subject headings, to help expand on subject headings that are insufficient in LCSH, including adding names of Native American nations that are more appropriate than all of the LCSH terms that include the word Indians. And finally, we intend to expand the project to look at the usage of other broad subject headings in our local records. Some ideas of broad headings to investigate include folk music and popular music. I would like to thank everyone for coming to our presentation today. We hope that we have given you all some food for thought on working towards creating more inclusive library catalog records for music materials. We're happy to take any questions as well as to facilitate discussion with everyone here on inclusive cataloging practices now.
So Linda, we had a request if you can put up your reference screen again.
Oh, yeah.
So, and one question that came through as you're doing that, are you a standalone library or a member of a consortium? And do you use Dewey? Where do you place them?
We use Library of Congress classification, and we're basically a standalone library. And so for our CDs, we actually use accession numbers. We don't attempt to put them into Library of Congress classification.
There's also a question in the chat about the term, the LCSH term, Indigenous peoples subdivided by Canada or the United States, which is not valid in LCSH because it's a C reference under United States, under Indians of North America. So they were asking about the coding on your 650 field, if it should be 654 or 657 with a subfield 2 of local.
So we were not using Indigenous Peoples United States. We were going a little bit broader and using North America as the geographic subdivision for that one, which I believe is an approved form of that heading. And I don't remember running into issues with the geographic subdivision for Canada, but maybe that has changed since we did this project.
It looks like some more questions are coming in. Are you hiding from public view or remapping subjects in your catalog, or just leaving them there and adding the additional vocabulary?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we don't currently have the ability to hide subject headings from our public view and still have them be searchable, if that makes sense. So we're just adding additional terms at this point in time.
Okay, there's another question. Is the term Indigenous Peoples North America being used across disciplines or only in music? Are you replacing the term Indians or supplementing, which you kind of answered already? You can't hide things.
Right, we can't hide things, and overall, our library's stance on problematic headings is that since we're a PCC institution, we should not be removing official LCSH terms from records. even if we disagree with them. So we're simply supplementing them at this time.
Okay. Nate, if you could assist Clara, and I will keep asking questions here.
Video should be enabled now.
How did you narrow your search to just Indians of North America without any other subject headings?
So our ILS that we use right now is Sierra, and I did some magic in the create lists function in Sierra to narrow down the search. Basically.
Are you aware of research that has been done to ask Indigenous peoples what they would wish to be referenced as? I know this is not the focus of your work, but you might know something about it.
Yeah, that is a really great question. A lot of what I've come across has been related to people reaching out to like their local communities. So I guess it's a little hard to generalize, since generalizing is what gets us into trouble a lot of the time with these things. But there's definitely research and work being done by people to include Indigenous peoples in this conversation.
Can you address a little bit further the issue of how recordings are marketed versus our desire to accurately reflect group identities and specificity? This has been a bone of contention in regard to music of the American folk revival, which in many cases was arguably not folk music.
Yeah, that is a really great question. There's definitely an issue with marketing versus accurately reflecting group identities. And we have discussed like how we would even go about looking at records with folk music as a subject and trying to make them more specific. And it immediately becomes a problem with, this exact thing where American folk revival is considered in marketing circles to be folk music, but it's arguably not folk music. And so the definition of folk music is definitely one that is hard to tack down really specifically.
Yeah, I would add that it's gotten a much broader interpretation than was originally ascribed to it.
I lost audio on my end there, Clara, if you wouldn't mind repeating yourself.
I said there are a lot more definitions abroad about folk music than there were originally when it meant something quite specific, and it makes it difficult to deal with in terms of description because of the kind of loose usage that is pretty much prevalent now.
We have another question. As our library uses LC classification schedule for sound recordings, I frequently come across examples where those schedules obscure entire groups of people, the Sami, for example. Is there ever any move to change those schedules, or are they forever set in stone?
Yeah, there's definitely issues like that with LC classification. They're pretty prevalent for Indigenous peoples. I'm sure someone on this call can give a more specific answer, but I believe the LC classification can be changed, but it is a slow process.
Okay. are you working with the print librarian or department to see if these headings might need fixing or supplementing in your book collection, in fiction or nonfiction?
Yeah, that is a great question. So it's definitely a topic of discussion, like across our libraries, how to address various problematic headings in LCSH. So a lot of the work that has been done in our print collection up to the present has related to the illegal aliens terms and related headings there. And
Two of the people who led that have found positions elsewhere. So I'm not sure.
Your mic's a little low again.
I'll try again. I'm sorry, my equipment is a little subpar. The two people who most led the charge to change illegal aliens to undocumented immigrants is in the slide that I showed, have both relocated to other institutions. So I'm not really very aware myself what is being done in the cataloging of monographs in this regard. And I don't know if you are, Linda.
I think at present, our special collections department has people working on updating descriptions and like summaries for their collections. I think that's the biggest thing that is currently happening. And I would say there's definitely conversations happening about addressing terms like everything that involves Indians, but nothing concrete is happening across our print book libraries people right now.
There's a lot of catching up from pandemic restrictions going on.
There's some more comments in the chat. If anyone has questions, please feel free to submit those. There's a comment about a lot of popular music that is not actually very popular. There's a comment about the LC class schedules. They are modified along a similar proposal process as subject headings. However, not even all SACO libraries have access to that. So thank you for sharing that, Rocky. There's another comment about there is an assumption that ethnic diasporas are coextensive with ethnic musical communities, which is often not the case. So describing the music of, say, non-Irish American Irish traditional can get sticky.
Yeah,
I didn't understand any of that comment, but I'm sure y'all understand.
Yeah, I've definitely like cataloged things where I am trying desperately to determine if the person is emulating a musical style or if they are actually like, you know, they have a background or an ethnic tie-in to their music that they are producing. And it can be really difficult to differentiate or even determine what the most appropriate subject headings is or are for any given recording.
I will say, I've been requested by my supervisor to focus on scores over CDs because of the enormous backlog that accumulated over the last term of the pandemic. So the heavy lifting on musical things that are actually music, like CDs, is being taken on by Linda. So she's got to answer those questions.
Not seeing any other questions in the chat right now, but please feel free if anyone thinks of anything to add them in. Or if there's anything else, Linda or Clara, that you'd like to say that wasn't included in the presentation.
Thank you for inviting us.
Yeah, thank you for inviting us. We're really happy to be here today.
Well, thank you both for agreeing to speaking. We appreciate it. Thank you both, and Kelsey as well. And if there's no other questions, we will now go to lunch. The Zoom room will remain open and for conversation and socialization, but it won't be recorded. We'll come back for a NASL fall business meeting promptly at 1:30, where we'll be voting on bylaw changes. And have a good lunch, everyone. Thank you again.
Thank you.
All right. So everybody should have received the minutes from the spring 2021 meeting in your emails. After reviewing them, do we have any comments or objections? Good. Can I get a move to approve the spring 2021 meeting minutes? Please just enter your first and last name in the chat, please. A move to pass the minutes? Anyone? Thank you. And do I have a second? Okay, I will mix it up with those names. Thank you very much, Rocky and Teresa and Margaret and Regina and Stephanie. The minutes are approved. And I think we're on to the treasurer's report.
Hi, everyone. I will share my screen real quick so you can see the treasurer's report. Hopefully you will see that now. Similar with Aaron, we're asking for a motion to approve and a second, and my chat screen is gone. So if someone can please track that for me and let me know.
Yeah, I'll be tracking that.
Okay. Do we have a motion to approve? Oh,
Teresa has moved to approve.
Okay. And second, please.
And Nate
as
has
always-
seconded.
As always, if anyone has any questions about the treasurer's report, please let me know. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen right now. And I also want to say to everybody, thank you for your patience with us. If you have any questions about registration or anything, please email me or Nate or that. And that's all the contact is on our website. But I do thank everybody for their patience. We usually have about 50 to 70 NOTSL attendees, and because this is a virtual meeting and great topics with great speakers, we had 150 attendees for this meeting. So this is our biggest meeting on this level. So thank you everybody for coming and for working with us on this.
Wow.
And now we'll get a scholarship update from Nate.
Yeah, so there's really no update there. Our last spring meeting, we were unable to fulfill any scholarship applications. We had chosen an individual, and because of a schedule conflict, that individual decided not to participate in classes anymore. So we were basically backed out on that one. There were a couple of other issues, if you saw in the bylaws, how we treat scholarship. And it was more towards the, if somebody doesn't use a scholarship to its fullest extent, how do they refund it to us? With that particular student, we just allowed them to buy particular books that for the classes. But going forward, we're going to probably develop a little bit better of a system for that. But keep an eye out for the upcoming applications to go out. We will discuss that at our next meeting. And once we finalize the amount that we are going to give away, then we will release the scholarship applications at that time, which then those will be awarded at our spring conference.
Well, thank you, Nate. I assume that everyone has had the opportunity to look at the changes to our bylaws. I think that Nate will have a Zoom poll, if I'm not mistaken.
So let me go ahead and release that poll. It's a quick yes or no. You can abstain if you'd like.
Yeah, does anybody want to give a brief overview of what things have changed in the bylaws?
So one of the major changes of the bylaws happens to be the addition of a new position, which is going to include technology and communications. And that will be an appointed position by the Knoxville chair, just for continuity purposes. And then most of the other updates had to regard just bringing the bylaws into the now, updating a lot of the lingo and making sure that it was current. So I'll give another 20 seconds on that poll, and it looks like we have no votes for no, so it's probably going to pass.
So really quickly, for Kathleen's question, we generally had our technology and communications be handled by a random board member, and we wanted to make that a specific role for continuity purposes instead of just hoping that someone would have those skills is basically the rundown.
And to reiterate, Kathleen, that is appointed. It's an appointed position for continuity purposes, so that the chair can appoint somebody to do that. Basically, either from the board, or if they feel that they need to have an elected official do that, we can opt to have maybe like a resume submission or something like that.
Part of the reason why we did this is because as we become increasingly more dependent on things like Zoom and remote resources, it gets a lot more complicated. And this is only, I think, if I remember correctly, our second remote meeting. And it's proving to be very popular. And I think that it is, you know, something that's probably not going to go away. And I think it really stabilizes Knoxville to be able to do this. So.
All right, so I went ahead and stopped it. So we had about 3.5 minutes to vote, and it looks like we have no answers for no. Many of you have abstained, but the majority says yes, so we will go ahead and approve the bylaw changes for 2020.
Thank you, Nate. Appreciate it. And thank you, everyone, for taking the time to vote. Now we'll have the attendee appreciation, and Laura will be handling that.
Laura, you're muted.
Yep, I gotcha. I'm back sharing my screen here. You can see I've got a list of everyone that I'm going to throw into this nifty wheel of names picker. So what we are doing for those who have not attended before, every meeting we choose 2 attendees to receive a free meeting in the future. That can be any meeting. I do keep track of these. So if you would like to use it at any future meeting, just reach out to me and let me know. So our first free meeting attendee is Joanne Harder. So Joanne, please note that you are able to attend one of our future Knoxville meetings for free, either in person or virtual, depending on what we do going forward. And we are going to do one more. And the winner is Joan Milligan.
Yay,
Erin, did you get those?
congratulations.
Yep, I got the
Thanks.
names.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thanks, Erin. And thanks everyone.
All right, our final presenter is Leonard Leo Martin. Leo is a resource description librarian for unique formats and materials at University of Houston Libraries. Leo's research interests include metadata description and access and the development of modern musical microgenres. He is also an active member of the Music Librarian Association, MLA, and Music Online Users Group, MOOC. Leo received his undergraduate degree in music education and a master's degree in library information and science from the University of North Texas. He previously worked at the New England Conservatory of Music as their catalog librarian. Leo will present Ghost in the Machine, Mark Sheen, Pseudonymity and Anonymity, Usage in Electronica Music Sound Recordings. And with that, I give you Leo.
And thanks again for having me today. I decided to go with the pun title because I just couldn't help myself and I haven't done one yet. So just some quick housekeeping. This presentation includes both audio and video media. We just had a bit of a preview before, so I've done my best to ensure that the volume is adequate, but I hope each participant can make any local adjustments they need to for playback. All right, so let's jump right into Ghost in the Mark Sheen. Today's presentation builds on 2 earlier ones I gave on microgenres in May of 2020 and February of 2021. The first, Microgenres, A Cataloger's Dilemma, discussed challenges catalogers can encounter when describing popular music sound recordings, including musical microgenres. The second, Microgenres, Memory, Community, and Preserving the Present, discussed microgenres as a cultural phenomena and metadata description for musical microgenres in a library environment. Today, we'll discuss pseudonymity and antonymity usage in electronica music sound recordings. Part 1 discusses the concept of genre, navigating taxonomies, and the development of microgenres as a cultural phenomena, as well as common challenges with metadata description for works with electronic instruments. Part 2 discusses constructing name authority records for anonymous or pseudonymous persons based on the Library of Congress and participants of cooperative cataloging frequently asked questions document. So I'll be saying that in an abbreviated form later because it's a bit of a mouthful. And lastly, we'll wrap up with key takeaways, and if there's time, I can provide additional examples reflecting the topics discussed today. I'll open with a quote from Legacy Russell's book, Glitch Feminism. To glitch is to embrace malfunction, and to embrace malfunction is in and of itself an expression that starts with no. Genre as defined by John Froh. Genre, we might say, is a set of conventional and highly organized constraints on the production and interpretation of meaning. Genre creates effects in reality and truth, authority and plausibility, which are central to the different ways the world is understood in the writing of history or philosophy or science, or in painting, or in everyday talks. Next, genre is defined in the Introduction to Library of Congress genre form terms. Genres and forms may be broadly defined as categories of resources that share known conventions. More specifically, genre and form terms may describe the purpose, structure, content, and/or themes of resources. There's also Plato's literary genres, poetry, drama, and prose, the earliest known Western examples of the genre. I define genre as a conversation. Genres provide people, groups, and organizations with a shared language of terms and concepts to better facilitate interaction with and description of the world around them and relationships amongst themselves. We'll do a brief overview of controlled vocabularies. When assigning terms to resources, as discussed in earlier presentations, catalogers should be thinking about isness and aboutness. That is, knowing when they're assigning headings for what a resource is about, or assigning headings for what a resource is. This presentation will focus primarily on the latter, assigning appropriate headings for what things are, including agents, works, and expressions. The Library of Congress has several controlled vocabularies in production. Today we'll be discussing the list of vocabularies below. Next is a list of non-LC taxonomies and ontologies. The top two vocabularies listed on isness focus on isness and are describing tabletop games and video games respectively. The Homosaurus is an international linked data vocabulary of LGBTQ+ terms that supports improved access to LGBTQ resources within cultural institutions. The current linked data version was released in 2019, and the original was created in 1997 as a standalone vocabulary. Wikidata is a free, collaborative, multilingual secondary database collecting structured data to provide support for Wikipedia, Wikimedia Commons, and other wikis of the Wikimedia movement. Wikidata utilizes linked data and subject predicate object statements, or triples, to describe things, and also utilizes functional requirements for bibliographic records, as well as a two-layer framework of work and addition for manifestations. Lastly are uncontrolled terms and locally assigned subject headings. Uncontrolled terms can appear as either structured data and resources or supplied as structured data with locally assigned subject headings and assigned the subfield code of local in a MARC environment. Uncontrolled terms can be co-located into a folksonomy. Folksonomies are user-generated tags which are aggregated by machines into controlled lists. Bandcamp uses algorithms and content management in its discovery feature, as well as Every Noise at Once, a website and API created by Glenn McDonald, which is also powered by the Spotify API. Taxonomies define groups of words and their relationships, which are often hierarchical in relationship. We'll use the authorized term electronica music and LC genre form thesaurus as our example of how taxonomies work. LC began designing the thesaurus in 2007 to describe what a resource is rather than what it is about, distinguishing itself from what subject headings do. We can define broader terms which appear as see also tracings in MARC field 555 with the subfield W coded G. Popular music is a broader term assigned to electronica music. We can also define narrower terms which appear as see also references in MARC field 555 with the subfield W coded H. Electronica music has the narrower terms ambient music electronica, electronic dance music, new jazz, synth pop, and vaporwave music. Within electronic dance music, we can assign the broader terms dance music and electronica music. We can also assign use for terms which appear as variant access points in MARC field 455. Variant access points for electronic dance music include club music and the genre's abbreviation EDM. We can also change the variant access point subfield W to a NNNE with the E standing for earlier heading. This appends the term with the text former heading and can better facilitate access to the currently used term. Some taxonomies also use related terms which denote associative relationships rather than hierarchical ones. These relationships can be further defined or distinguished in a 680 scope note field. Lastly, we can supply a subfield W coded NNNA to suppress a previously used reference from displaying in the catalog. There are currently no genre form terms that I found that utilize this feature. Instead, it's more commonly found in established person names or corporate bodies. This slide will discuss electronic musics and the Library of Congress subject headings. Generally, do not use electronic music accessible to LCSH for popular musical works. There are some exceptions to this regarding narrower terms, which we'll touch on later. However, electronic music is reserved for works best described as art music. And this is an abbreviation of Western art music, right? So this kind of difference between the academy and things outside of the academy, which is a barrier that's like coming down more and more, as we'll see over the course of this presentation. The key takeaway here is to treat electronic music as other medium performance headings in LCSH. Electronics is treated as a medium performance and follows standard LCSH conventions for assigning the term. The scope note tells catalogers that they'll need to construct a subject heading with electronics treated as an instrument. Construction of headings follows that of other musical forms. Please note that this includes following the order of instruments by family and then alphabetically within each family. Electronics is lumped in with percussion and other instruments, other being this very broad amorphous category that doesn't fit into pre-existing hierarchies. So all these instruments are arranged alphabetically within their group. Also treat tape, also known as pre-recorded audio, as electronics in LCSH. Also supply the term electronic music if the work isn't brought out by a form heading within the resource. So if you have sonatas electronic, that you're kind of covered. But if you have, choruses with another ensemble, you can add electronic music if there's no way to incorporate the term electronics into that earlier heading. And there's examples listed on a slide much later in the presentation. Treat electronics like percussion and omit the number of performing instruments if there is more than one type of electronic instrument present. See also the narrower term computer music. This subject heading is assigned for musical works not in a specific form or type in which sounds are generated or altered using digital technology. This term is used for electroacoustic music, which actually is a variant form for the term, using computers. And please refer to the LC Subject Cataloging Manual H 1917.5, which includes instructions on usage and several examples with electronics. See also those darn electronic music headings on the Music Cataloging at Yale website for additional information and examples. Next, we'll be discussing working with electronic instruments in LCMPT. When working with electronic instruments in the Library of Congress Medium Performance Thesaurus, I like to divide instruments into two groups, generic and distinctive. Generic instruments are instruments that represent broad classes of electronic instruments and don't specify what instruments or equipment is producing a sound or images. For example, pre-recorded audio could be a tape deck playing back a cassette, or reel-to-reel tape being played back, or it could even be an audio file played from a phone with a Bluetooth speaker and performed live as an instrument with tape. Distinctive instruments are typically classified under horn-bossel sax with the qualifier electronic. So this could be an electric violin, an electric bassoon. Distinctive also includes electronic instruments designed from the ground up with no acoustic alternative. They're called electrophones and horn-bossel sax. And they usually appear with this definition: an acoustic or solid-bodied instrument that is electronically amplified. However, there's general confusion over when to use an electric popular instrument, an electric folk instrument, or a traditional orchestral instrument in LCMPT. For example, differentiating between electronic plucked instruments and bowed instruments. For example, bass guitar is arranged under electric guitar since it is an acoustic instrument that is electronically amplified and has electric bass as a variant access point. However, an upright electric bass is not a electric bass in LCMPT. It is instead expressed as double bass with a subfield V stating, and V is a note field in LCMPT stating electric double bass. Note that the difference between these instruments is that the double bass is a plectral plucked instrument, and a bass guitar is a plectral plucked instrument, and a double bass is typically upright and bowed. Distinctive also includes MIDI controllers, synthesizers, and other electronic instruments. Note that controller instruments are electronic instruments that can be mapped with preset sounds and do not actually produce sounds themselves. Controller interfaces can physically appear as or mimic acoustic instruments. For example, a wind controller, also referred to as an EUE, electronic wind instrument for short, can appear like a clarinet or saxophone with physical keywork and buttons. However, the instrument itself does not produce sound. Instead, the player's air pressure when blowing into the instrument registers along with preset fingerings and renders sound through a MIDI interface on an accompanying computer. The same is applied to percussive sounds on a DrumCat interface, another type of percussion controller, which mimics a snare drum or, in some cases, an entire drum set. Lastly, please refer to the MLA best practices for using LCMPT document for additional examples and instructions. This document discusses practices including using narrow terms whenever available, or in our above double bass example, using the closest instrument and adding a subfill B note for identification and access. The document was updated last year and clarifies using visuals and mixed media for video recordings of performances too. Piece for Tenor Balloon was performed by the composer Judy Dunaway at the New England Conservatory of Music Composer Series concert in 2019. In the composer's essay, The Balloon Music Manifesto, she states, quote, "By using my hands, mouth, and body, I could control tiny sensitive manipulations that open the door to greater possibilities for my instruments." She later states, "My own works then does not come out of the void. Creating a large body of work for balloons has allowed me to develop a vocabulary outside the realm of oppressive classical heritage. It has raised the ordinary and mundane to the highest state of art," end quote. Here's an example of the composer performing the work in 2012. As discussed earlier, the instrument balloon appears in LCMPT, coded here in a 382 field with a subfield B note for amplified tenor balloon. Next are subject headings, balloon and electronic music, with balloon alphabetically preceding electronics, because balloon's classified as an other instrument, and the genre form term chamber music, since this is a work of art music. Lastly is the authorized access point for the work seen here. Piece is a type of musical work, or generic, if you're thinking ACR2, qualified by immediate performance of balloon and electronics. One thing of note is that the composer is performing the balloon as a percussion instrument here. This work shows both the application of the electronic music terms, but also the limitations of the horn, bossel, sax classification scheme. Electronica music has the use for term electronic popular music in broader terms, dance music and popular music. And this term appears in both LCSH and LCGFT. The following citations outline the development of electronic popular music from electroacoustic works closely associated with or created as art music. So in this example refers to all popular non-academic electronic music. So that A makes a big difference. Electronica music again has identical records in both LCSH and LCGFT. Do not use the term electronica music for works more accurately described as art music. So again, that A has a big distinction here. Now, frequently used narrower terms include electronic dance music and ambient music electronica. Note that electronic dance music has 10 narrower terms, including techno music, house music, and the recently established term trance electronic dance music. One common occurrence in the catalog is electronic music assigned to popular works, and less commonly electronica music assigned erroneously to art music. The scope notes for each term are explicit for which term to assign to what works. However, there are some instances where it can be difficult to know which term to use. Another issue is that most popular idioms after 1950 feature electronic instruments, especially after the 1970s, alongside the development of what we now broadly refer to as electronica music. Performers are often explicit about what terms and genres they associate with their own music. This can be helpful with classification, but having a general knowledge of what narrower terms and their applicability can prove indispensable. Whenever possible, assign a narrower term to reflect the music being performed or the genre exemplified in the recording. Follow Emily's best practices for LCGFT and choose the most specific term available. For example, prefer using electronic dance music over electronica music. And then we also have the example of musique concrète over art music. This also applies to works that fall under art music too. This is also suggested in the BPs for LCGFT document. Additionally, if an error term does not exist in LCGFT and warrants inclusion, take note later and propose the term to the Seiko music funnel, which we'll discuss in a later slide. One notable example, however, of electronic music and electronica music and some of the confusion around them is ambient music, which origins are functional, artistic, and also popular. And we'll discuss ambient music at greater length here in a second. But the real question is, what should a cataloger do when a work meets the criteria for both electronic music and electronica music? In this example, we have a work by an ambient producer who's looping material in a cassette tape. If the sound recording is in a popular idiom and includes works that fall under a narrower art music term, use both electronica music and, if possible, a narrower art music term, or vice versa. Onto the microgenre. The term microgenre can broadly be defined as a type of small culture, as in when we talk about microgenres, we're often referring to something that exists within the zeitgeist of a pre-existing genre. The essay collection, The Microgenre, A Quick Look at Small Culture, edited by Molly O'Donnell and Ann Stevens, heavily influences this discussion on small cultures. The editors compile several essays concerning microgenres within literature, the visual arts, and performing arts. From these texts, my own research, and other literature cited here, I've attempted to provide a multifaceted definition of the microgenre. First, a hyperspecific subcategory of artistic, musical, or literary composition that is characterized by a particular style, form, or content. Second, a flexible, provisional, and temporary category used to establish microconnections among cultural artifacts, drawn from a range of historical periods and from literature, film, music, television, and other performing visual arts. And lastly, a microgenre can be a specialized or niche genre, either machine classified or retroactively established through analysis. Here are examples of how our multiple definitions for microgenres can map to various styles of music. In this instance, we have hyperspecific microgenres, which can be described as you know it when you hear it. For example, chopped and screwed music has a very distinctive sound with specific sociocultural origins in the Houston, Texas hip hop scene. The culture that surrounds chopped and screwed music is just as important as the sound itself, and rarely are they divorced from each other. This term appears in both LCSH and LCGFT. A type of flexible, provisional, and temporary microgenre is vaporwave music. And it's a microgenre without clearly defined borders. Additionally, its sociocultural origins are not fixed geographically, but rather it proliferated initially online via the World Wide Web in the early 2010s. Numerous artists released singles and albums self-described as vaporwave. However, the vapor scene and its musical and visual iconography can vary dramatically depending on a variety of factors. Creation and submission of this term to the Seiko music funnel is discussed on a later slide. And lastly, an example of a specialized or niche musical microgenre is ambient music. Ambient music sits at the intersection of natural sound, human and/or machine-made sounds, and functional music or commercial music. Ambient music has grown into a very popular and dynamic microgenre with significant contributions to the experimental and avant-garde music at large. Due to the specialized and niche nature of ambient music, there are multiple genres terms in both LCSH and GFT, which will be discussed in detail later. These microgenres can be further broken down into subgenres. Hyperspecific subgenres of microgenres, right? It's getting a little overwhelming, right? Include lowercase music, a type of hyper-minimalist ambient music featuring barely audible fluctuations in pitch and timbre using austere sounds bordering on noise and bliss. Whereas future funk is a derivative of vaporwave music featuring bass-boosted, city pop-inspired, plunderphonic, or easily composed works. Flexible, provisionary, and temporary subgenres include dream punk and hyperpop. Hyperpop is often overused and underdiscussed provisional microgenre, recently popularized by a now infamous Spotify playlist bearing the same name. Music self-described as hyperpop is both a reflection of frustration around electronic genre classification today and algorithmically co-located artists vying for relevance in an oversaturated streaming music landscape. Now, specialized and niche subgenres include dark ambient as well as slushwave. Slushwave is a derivative form of vaporwave music pioneered by electronic music producer Luke Lorida, who records under the moniker Telepath. Telepath's separate project, Virtual Dream Plaza, helped to establish the DIY production style that became known as slushwave. This microgenre is often identified by pop music, either sampled or originally composed, rendered at near half speed as a backing track, or without vocals. This music borders ambient and the ever elusively defined hypnagogic pop, and often is duly classified as vaporwave in order to reach a broader audience online. The following work is Demerol, which appears in the genre-defining album Echo James Volume 1 by Chuck Person. This album is often cited as one of the earliest fully realized examples of vaporwave music. As one could guess, the name Chuck Person is a pseudonym, and one used by electronic music producer Daniel Lopatin, who principally records as 106 Point Never, a play on Boston's FM 106.7 station. Echo jams are a type of artistic practice that Lopatin developed around 2008. Echo jams borrows principally from John Oswald's Blunderphonics, a type of sound collage work and artistic practice based around sampling. Echo jams take found material regardless of copyright, but with attribution, and either sample a work in whole or part, which is then slowed down, reminiscent of chopped and screwed music, often with digital artifacts either introduced in the process itself, either on accident or on purpose, such as glitch music, which results in a blended new work. This artistic practice culminated in Echo Jams Volume 1, released on August 8th, 2010, as 100 hand-dubbed cassettes as Chuck Person. I have an essay in the Association of Recorded Sound Collections newsletter out next spring, which details the various incarnations this album has taken. For now, we'll just appreciate Demerol. The now iconic album art for Echo Jams Volume 1 is inspired by the 1992 Sega Genesis or Sega CD video game Echo the Dolphin, seen here. The disc label features the same artwork. The title statement on the disc label appears on the container and was added as a 246 note. The edition statement is taken from Discogs because this release is based on a fan re-edit of the original audio files with some light pitch correction and playback speed adjustment. Lastly, this album was issued in a variety of colors, and a cataloger's note denotes the manifestation's color. Here's where this unique manifestation reveals itself with typos. Most notably, Chuck Person's Volume Q, seen in the first sentence here. This album is a high-quality fan release of unknown origin. In true Plunderphonics fashion, the album isn't advertised or available in physical form for long before it's removed due to copyright claims. The original hand-dubbed cassettes sell today on Discogs for over $400. Seen here, a 511 performance note was added showing the relationship between the pseudonym associated with and the real identity described on the container liner notes, performed by Chuck Person with a parenthetical Daniel Lopatin and an even smaller parenthetical for One of Tricks Point Never, which are all listed in the note seen there. One of Tricks Point Never's logo and the manufacturer's name appear on the container as well. Hence the lack of publication information in the 264 field seen here. Instead, the manufacturer statement and issue number are coded. The audio used as a basis for this record came from high-quality digitally remastered audio files Lopatin uploaded and sold as direct downloadables files on his personal website back in 2016. Lopatin also corrected the playback speed in the remaster, which differed dramatically on some tracks from the original cassette release. Lastly, the subject headings and genre terms reflect that this is one of the earliest albums cited as a vaporwave album. It should be noted that in 2016, electronic music producer and another vaporwave pioneer, Ramona Xavier, who records under the name Vectroid, bemused in an interview with Bandcamp that composer and Yellow Magic Orchestra member Ryuichi Sakamoto invented vaporwave over 30 years ago. Ambient music is a niche microgenre that encompasses a breadth of natural sounds, acoustic and electronic instruments, and utilizes sampling and/or loop material to generate repetitive soundscapes. Brian Eno, composer, artist, and music producer, coined the term ambient music and describes its origins as, quote, "I suddenly thought of this idea of making music that didn't impose itself on your space in the same way, but created a sort of landscape that you could belong to and be a part of, and I pompously gave it a new name, which I called ambient music," end quote. It should be noted that ambience has origins outside of popular music, including composers Eric Satie and his furniture music, Pierre Chaffe's musique concrète, and aleatory works of John Cage, as well as Japanese composer Ryuichi Sakamoto. So there's that name again. Ambient music can also employ generative music, another term coined by Brian Eno. Generative music is a compositional process, either of pre-composed material or improvisational material, which creates ever-changing and ever-perpetuating music. Originally, this compositional style uses spliced and loop tapes, so that's their musique concrète kind of coming back, but has since moved into algorithmically assisted processes, including those found on the website Listen to Wikipedia or in video game music, Overworld music. There are several established terms for ambient music in the Library of Congress. Ambient music appears in LCSH and has a broader term of electronic music. As a result, art music and narrower terms are more appropriate as genre form terms. Ambient music electronica in LCGFT has a broader term of electronica music and should be used for all ambient works that fall under popular idioms. Ambient sounds is a type of functional music and should be used for works that are composed or adapted to accompany activities or events or to incite actions and emotions for use in particular locations. There are several other related terms in GFT to ambient music, most notably is background music, which has the used for term environmental music. Environmental music is a style of ambient music pioneered by Japanese electronic producers in the late 1970s and early 1980s called Kankyo Ongaku, which typically incorporates improvisation, field recordings, and minimal processing, also known as noise. Note that in LCGFT, environmental music is a variant access point for background music. However, in LCSH, environmental music is the main heading and background music is the variant access point. Soundscapes music is often used to describe music that evokes a particular sense of place or time, whereas minimal music is an art music term popularized in the 1960s and is compositionally associated with repetitive patterns, consonant chords, and brevity, or phrases that extend past the average listener's ability to anticipate changes in rhythm or harmony. New Age music is a more well-known term for its commercial rise in the 1980s and early 1990s, and persists today in so-called mood or meditation playlists on streaming services. However, this term should be used sparingly. Some New Age works can incorporate aspects of indigenous cultures as well as East Asian and South Asian cultural practices, often without attribution or any real regard for the cultures it's trying to emulate or reproduce in some cases. I suggest reading up on movements like solar punk for a more modern approach to this type of music. Lastly, improvisation music and aleatory music are often incorporated into ambient works, as seen earlier in some of these definitions. If the sound recording explicitly states that the works performed incorporate these two compositional and performance practices, please include them. However, avant-garde music should be used sparingly, but can sometimes prove useful for works that fall into the left field, which is a folksonomy term used to describe music that doesn't comfortably fit within a specific genre or style. Oneohtrix Boy Never released his 5th studio album, Replica, on November 8th, 2011. This album was released a year after Echo Jams Volume 1 and incorporates many of the concepts and production techniques Lopatin explored on that album. This includes tightly looped materials, sparse vocal samples, and extensive use of sound collage punctuated with silence. Here's a brief excerpt from the self-titled track, Replica. The prominently featured album cover art is by acclaimed sci-fi fantasy and horror artist Virgil Finlay, and originally appeared in the serialized novella Loot of the Vampire by Thorpe McCluskey. That name is actually not a pseudonym. Both disc labels are blank, which resulted in the title being taken from the container spine. The publication information is taken from the container as well. Software is Lopatin's personal label, and Mexican Summer is the distributor, seen here. This manifestation is also a reprint from the originally released vinyl in 2011, represented by the 534 field seen here. Additionally, the album comes with liner notes printed on a single sheet and is double-sided, with a statement responsibility for Lopatin seen here. Subject headings and genres are seen here. Please note that fixed fields 008 and comp and reciprocal 047 genre form term codes apply to the item as a whole when assigning genre form codes for a resource. In this instance, we're applying PP for popular music because it applies to the whole album. Also note that the bid formats and standards states do not use mark codes MU, NN, UU, or ZZ in field 047. In this instance, we would not assign an additional code for ZZ and ambient music or music concrete. So you wouldn't have an 047 coded PP as well as ZZ in a subfield A. You just only have the fixed field of PP. A generic medium performance is assigned in the 382 field of electronics, alongside electronica music, ambient music, and music concrete with reciprocal genre form terms. Note the use of ambient music electronica in the 655 field. Also note in this presentation, duplicate 650 and 655 fields will be handled with the character X, and the code will be omitted from the field 2, seen here. The submission of vaporwave music for inclusion in LCGFT took about 6 months from inception to its inclusion. The purchase of Echo Jams Volume 1 created literary warrant for vaporwave music's inclusion in the controlled vocabulary. The proposal was sent to the Seiko Music Funnel coordinator, Beth Eisminger, in early January. I drafted the proposal as an email following the instructions listed on the Seiko Music page, with a little bit of extra information here. I suggest reviewing the LCGFT manual, especially JA120, on when to establish a new genre form. Be mindful of 6xx notes, including clarity and omissions in your submission, as well as citing sources not found. So those appear in 675 notes. So you can say not found in Grove Music, et cetera, et cetera. Lastly, consider adding a 680 scope note for additional clarification for usage. The term was submitted by the Seiko Music Funnel coordinator in the Minaret system in March, and the term appeared on the subject headings monthly list. So it appears as the tentative list, and then it later appears on the authorized term list. In June, the term was added to the authority file and authorized for use. So again, it took about 6 months from the inception of the term to its actual production in the genre form terms. Pseudonymity and anonymity in electronica music. A pseudonym is a fictitious name taken or given to a person or group for a given reason. Some pseudonyms are based on an individual's real name or group shared interests. Names can also be based on an aspect of an individual's life or works that are associated with the pseudonym used. Pseudonymity and anonymity appears in societies around the world and within known recorded history. Historically, false names have served many purposes, including concealing identities from discrimination or persecution. They're also used as pen names by authors and artists, stage names by musicians, or shared amongst a group for various creative or legal endeavors. Some of the earliest known examples of pseudonymity come from ghost-written speeches and other works in ancient Rome. Publius, a joint pseudonym used by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, was used to anonymously write the Federalist Papers. K.A. Applegate is a pen name used by various authors in the Animorphs young adult fiction series, principally shared by Catherine Applegate and Kimberly Moss. The advent of the information age has led to a more expansive use of pseudonymity and anonymity by people. Today we'll be focusing on electronica music producers. In the mid-1990s through early 2000s, the cost of commercial electronics dropped and households began purchasing personal computers, which helped facilitate the emergence of DIY music production in the comforts of one's bedroom, hence the term bedroom pop that's been thrown around for a couple of years now. Think of all of the pre-internet bubble big box stores and mom and pop computer repair shops that used to exist. Chat rooms, message boards, and early social media websites and blogs led to the adoption of online avatars and usernames, which conferred both anonymity to users, as well as facilitating conformity within online affinity groups, which are often referred to as scenes both in the real world and the online world. Pseudonymity is often used by electronica music producers to distinguish between projects or to separate so-called serious works from other commercial works. The genre name functions as a signpost for people to associate with a given scene. And this applies to pretty much any and all genres. You can kind of ballpark what a type of sound a band's going to produce by its so-called genre name. Anonymity persisted in the 2010s online and electronic music scene due to the ability to create digital-born works, disseminate them online, and perform incognito, virtually, or even live. Copyright, the creation of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, led to the proliferation and inevitable clampdown on early peer-to-peer networks and protocols, including Napster, the Pirate Bay, and others. The book Spotify Teardown from MIT Press lays out the origins of streaming giant Spotify's originating on its founders' personal computers and their music collections stored on laptops and shared and distributed across a peer-to-peer network before they went so-called straight and got a lot of investment from a couple of not-to-be-named firms. The advent of social media and always online platform capitalism has eroded privacy for many musicians, blurring the lines between fans, critics, and collaborators. This has resulted in many artists revealing their earlier projects and taking efforts to associate most of their earlier names under a primary pseudonym. One example is electronic producer David Russo, also known as HKE, which is an abbreviation for Hong Kong Express. He has over 50 known pseudonyms in use. His primary pseudonym today, however, is Lucid, but he previously performed most of his works as Hong Kong Express and helped shape the subgenre dream punk, which was mentioned earlier with vaporwave producer Telepath, Luke Lorilla, in their group 2814. The following document, which he discussed earlier, was based on previous AACRT practices at LC and shared with NACO participants and published in 2015. It is found in RDA under the LC policy statement for, well, LC PCC policy statement for 9.2.2.8. And it's for updating existing authorized access points to separate out variant names into their own separate name authority records, which we'll go over in a second. The document discusses 6 situations, which I'm just going to go through. When a person uses one pseudonym and never uses their real name. When a person uses their real name and uses one pseudonym. When a person uses more than one name and they may or may not use their real name. There are also joint pseudonyms discussed in the document. Joint pseudonyms are not corporate bodies. A joint pseudonym is when 2 or more people share a unique name and create and publish works under that name. One common issue is collectives. Some groups use collectives for works in a similar idiom, topic, or subject area, and may or may not use the false name to publish works. So sometimes you'll see the term collective thrown around. that can kind of go either way, and we'll discuss some of that later. So here are the examples for when to create name authority records for joint pseudonyms. When a pseudonym represents a joint collaboration by 2 or more persons, and there are no existing records in the name authority file for the participants' real names. When a pseudonym represents a joint collaboration by 2 or more persons, each of whom uses their real name in published works and their works under their real names in the catalog. And lastly, a pseudonym used by several persons working independently of each other. If you encounter a situation outside of the scope of this document or have suggestions or comments, please contact policy@loc.gov. The subsequent slides will go through each situation informed by this frequently asked questions document, the NACO participants manual, as well as existing instructions and documentation in RDA, including those policy statements listed earlier and best practices documents. So all of these things inform my personal experience with working pseudonymous works, which we're going to get into detail here. So this is scenario A1.1. The person uses one pseudonym and never uses the real name. This is actually the most common situation for pseudonymity. So you're going to get a bunch of RDA chapters and the old RDA thrown at you. So don't worry, you don't have to memorize it. Just know that this information is all going to be here and shared out. So I'll just read through this and then we'll have examples later. So in this instance, you would see the exception for RDA 9.2.2.8, which states if an individual uses only one pseudonym and does not use his or her real name as a creator or contributor, choose a pseudonym as a preferred name for person. For variant names, follow the instructions at RDA 9.2.3.4, real name. If the preferred name or names for an individual are pseudonyms and the individual does not use their real name as a creator or contributor and the individual's real name is known, then record the individual's real name as a variant name for each pseudonym. The use of a pseudonym over a real name is common for musicians, authors, and visual artists. However, do not confuse a mononymous person with that of a pseudonym. This includes names like Beyonce for Beyonce Knowles, or surnames in the case of Liberace, or a middle name in the case of Rihanna. In these instances, follow instructions for RDA 9.2.2.6, different names for the same person. Also include a fuller form of name as described in RDA 9.2.2.5.1 as a variant access point. Generally, you want to qualify mononyms with either a birth date or a death year, as well as their occupation or some type of other way to disambiguate other artists or performers or whatever they're using the name for. And lastly, do not confuse a singularly used pseudonym with a fictitious person or a joint pseudonym. In those instances, please see the RDA references listed below. A1.2, the person uses the real name and uses only one pseudonym. So in this instance, you're going to go back to RDA 9.2.2.8, individual with more than one identity. If an individual has more than one identity, choose the name associated with each identity as the preferred name for that identity. You'll then have to create 2 name authority records. You'll add simple see also references in 500 fields or 5x fields linking the names. Optionally, you can include relationship designators from RDA seen in Appendix K2.1. And these will appear as subfield W's, coded R, followed by a subfield I with the relationship designator. Relationship designators to think about are alternate identity, which is used in the real name record, and then the reciprocal real identity would be supplied in the pseudonym record. Which brings us to our first case study, the curious case of Childish Gambino. So one way to think about pseudonymity is to ask yourself, why would someone publish works under a false name or alias? There's a running joke that Donald Glover looks a lot like Childish Gambino. In this instance, we have Donald Glover, the actor, comedian, and television producer, most well known for his role in the television series Community. However, not everyone knows that his alternate identity is Childish Gambino, the musician, lyricist, and music producer, most recently known for his 2016 album Awaken My Love and the work This Is America. And that Childish Gambino's real identity is that of Donald Glover. One common question working with pseudonyms is which name or name should be used in a bibliographic record for pseudonymous work. Here, the item in hand is attributed to Childish Gambino. However, a statement of responsibility on the item states all music by Donald Glover. My goal over the course of this presentation is to show you various scenarios, and I want the audience to ask themselves, if the name on the item is that of the pseudonym, and the users requesting the item are searching under the pseudonym, then what is the purpose of including the additional access point at the bibliographic level? And if so, how do we maintain bibliographic file integrity when authors and creators use multiple pseudonyms for multiple works, including when the real name does not appear on the item itself? So the following diagram will show agent-to-agent relationships represented here as triples, subject, predicate, object segments. Agent has work. Agent has alternate identity. Pseudonym has work. Pseudonym has real identity. Here's the same example applied in Mark. Pete Curry has work, advice on love. Pete Curry has alternate identity, FM Skyline. FM Skyline has work, Lightwear. FM Skyline has real identity, Pete Curry. Triples can also describe more complex relationships with statements. Agent has, pseudonym has work. However, relationships between agents and their pseudonymous works are unfortunately more difficult to express in Mark. These relationships generally appear as a 670 field citations, 663 field complex C also references, which we'll discuss more at length in a second, or in other 6xx field notes. FM Skyline is Pete Curry's sample-based project, which he releases synth-pop and vaporwave music as. Here's a very brief excerpt from FM Skyline's album Lightwear, and this track is Marble Madness. A1.3, more than one pseudonym. If a person uses more than one pseudonym and may or may not use their real name, create NARs for all the names. NAR construction includes the real name, if known, regardless of whether they have any known works. So this is for persons with more than one pseudonym. One name is selected as the basic heading. It is preferable to use the real name as the basic heading. The basic heading is chosen to facilitate which name is used for biographical or critical works or for classification of their works. Include C also references as 5xx fields for the other names. Also include a complex C also reference in the basic heading and in other names. The subsequent slides will go into further detail, but this information is presented here for convenience. So a 663 note is added to the basic heading with the following text. For works of this author, written under other names, search also under, and then you supply the other established forms of name. And then you proceed each one with the subfield B. Then there will be a similar note in the other name records. So you have the basic record and you have the other names. Note that the 663 note and the related names has a different text. Works by this author are identified by the name used in the item. So that's a very important point there. Works by this author are identified by the name used in the item. For listing of other names used by this author, search also under, and then you'll list the basic heading name alone. This is done to link the other names back to the basic heading. And then again, this LC-PCC policy statement for RDA 9.2.2.8 reappears. So now we'll go over agent-to-agent relationships for more complex multiple pseudonym situations. Agent may have work. So that's the big difference here. The real name may not have a work, or they might. It depends. Agent has alternate identity with a description of the pseudonym and its uses listed there. Pseudonym has work. Pseudonym has real identity. Agent has alternate identity. So this is a second pseudonym used by the primary agent. Pseudonym has work. Pseudonym has real identity. And then we can again have these more complex relationships expressed as triples. So agent has, pseudonym has work listed here. The following diagram shows another agent-to-agent relationship, and we're using the example George Clanton, who we'll talk about more in depth in a second. George Clanton, listed here, electronica musician and record label owner, has work Slide. George Clanton has alternate identity, Esprit, which is his sample-based music project. Esprit has work 200% electronica. Esprit has real identity George Clanton. George Clanton has alternate identity Mirror Kisses, which is his chill wave pop music project. Mirror Kisses has work Heartbeats. Mirror Kisses has real identity. And then here's that more complex triple that we talked about a second ago. George Clanton has alternate identity. Esprit has work 200% electronica. So here's everything expressed as mark. This is kind of something that's going to be more useful for catalogers who aren't working in a linked data environment. So I created a basic NAR record for George Clanton. So this is the basic NAR. This record can be used for works associated with George Clanton, and then also for any type of bibliographic works, those types of things. In this instance, I supplied 500 references to both Esprit and Mirror Kisses, which are coded with a NNNC. An NAR was created for Esprit with 500 complex C also reference back to George Clanton. And this is expressed as that 663 note you see here. You'll notice that the text has been slightly modified. I don't want to mouse over the screen, but you'll see that the word author has been swapped out with performer. The frequently asked questions document gives catalogers some leeway for unique situations. So that's what I decided to use in this instance. And then another NAR was created for Mirror Kisses, George Clanton's other work. But you'll notice that the 663 complex C also reference text is identical in both records because they go back to the basic NAR. And we'll have, I think, another example of this here in a second. 200% Electronica is an album by Esprit. The main heading is assigned to Esprit because that is the name that appears on the item as seen on the disc label here, and as represented in mark as well. The liner notes and additional statements of responsibility appear on the container, as zoomed in here. The liner notes describe how Esprit is George Clanton's sample-based project, and were transcribed as a statement of responsibility as 500 notes. So they were just transcribed in whole, and then it was clarified that everything was mastered by George Clanton, who is Esprit. And here's an example from the album. So that was a track called Secret from 200% Electronica. Now here's a clip of Keep a Secret, which is based off of George Clanton's other album, 100% Electronica. And if you look at the 500 note or at the actual container, you'll see the relationship between these two albums and what this actual project is about. So here's Keep a Secret from the original album. The relationship between George Clanton and Esprit is further established by a 511 performer note seen here, with the Japanese characters following Esprit represented in Romanized English below. Lastly, subject headings for the sound recording are seen here. A generic medium performance for electronics is supplied, along with Vaporwave Music LCSH and Vaporwave Music as the genre form term. So next, on to joint pseudonyms. Joint pseudonyms are pseudonyms that are used by multiple persons either collaboratively or independently of each other. The following slide describes how to handle joint pseudonyms when there are no existing names in the catalog. A1.4 describes if the pseudonym represents a joint collaboration by 2 or more persons and the catalog does not contain items by those persons under their real name, one NAR is created for the joint pseudonym alone. All of the names are listed as 400 references. Catalogers should use, what's that say? Oh, use for cases where 1 or more persons write under the real name and the others do not. So this is saying, if there's a mixture, which we'll discuss in a second, you'll actually have a combination of this and another type of joint pseudonym record. But this is fairly straightforward. Basically, if you have a joint pseudonym and they don't have anything in the catalog, you just put those unused, potentially real names as like variant access points, and then the record is actually for the joint pseudonym. So here's this example broken down. So in this instance, you'd create one name authority record for the joint pseudonym. Here you can see I've supplied a 368 subfield C antonyms and pseudonyms and LCSH to tell people that this is a fictitious person. And then you'll see that both persons represented here as person 1, person 2 are listed in variant access points as 400s. And then there is a 670 note that gives attribution to both names to the joint pseudonym. And then the bullet points just kind of cover everything I've talked about. So here, Alex person, the joint pseudonym, has collaborative work. And you'll use the NARs for published works associated with the joint pseudonym. And the citation should establish all the real names to this like particular name. Sorry for that quick transition there. In instances where 2 or more people create collaborative works and they also use their real names, and there are items in the catalog under the real names. So there's the text that it appears in the frequently asked questions document. You create one NAR for the joint pseudonym. Use the joint pseudonym as the basic heading. Create one NAR each for the associated names. Provide 500 C also references for each of the associated real names and the basic joint pseudonyms NAR. Lastly, if there are some names that do not have works in the catalog under their real names, then catalogers can apply a combination of the previous A1.4 example and the current A1.5, which we'll have represented on the next slide. So one basic NAR is created for the joint pseudonym. It's a lot of information, but it's everything we've kind of been talking about a second ago. In this example, we have 4 people sharing the name who have one collaborative work. Note that one person, Alexa Perception, is listed in the 400 field. That is because this is a mixture of situations, A1.4 and 1.5. One person does not have any works in the catalog, so they will only appear as a variant form of name when searched. In this instance, that's Alexa Perception. Below, the 663 complex he also referenced tells catalogers to search for the other persons and omit this in the example of Alexa Perception. So Alexa Perception will always show up as Alex person. Then 3 NARs are created for each other person, right? And in this instance, I've supplied demographic information to kind of differentiate because of really boring names, but you'll see that there's a 500 C also reference that's coded that W, N, and C. And I'll just go ahead and establish that W, subfield W, N, and C coding actually suppresses it. So these appear as related terms, like RT terms in the bid file, and they just link back to the main record. There's no relationship designator that actually appears. It just says related term and links back. So that's what that code actually does. In this instance, everyone has a record already in the catalog. So this is how you establish a joint pseudonym for people who already have records in the catalog, and you can also account for someone who doesn't have something in the catalog in the joint pseudonym itself. And then they all have that complex C also reference that links to this generic statement, right? For works of this author written in collaboration with Alexa Perception, person 1, person 2, and person 3 search also under, and then all of the established names are listed separated by subfield Bs. So this kind of covers everybody, and it links everyone back to that basic NAR that was created. So I'm going to run into the questions time a little bit, but we're pretty close. When a pseudonym is used by several persons working independently of each other, apply the instructions for A1.6. Create one NAR for the shared pseudonym. Treat the shared pseudonym record as the basic heading, so just like the similar examples. Create one record for everyone using the same pseudonym. Records for names associated with the shared pseudonym are established regardless of whether the persons using the same pseudonym created works under that name. So basically, everyone gets an NAR if they participated in the joint pseudonym, if they were using it independently of each other. And this can also be used in combination, which we'll see in the next slide. Def's Dynamic Shroud is a pseudonym shared amongst electronic producers and musicians Tech Honors, James Webster, and Keith Rankin. Each person also performs under various pseudonyms in other projects. The Def's Dynamic Shroud project began in 2014 as a series of mixtapes produced and released under James and Tech separately under the name Def's Dynamic Shroud Def's Dynamic Shroud.WMV. The name comes from an obscure YouTube video with that file name. So it wasn't like some really well thought out thing. They were just joking around and sharing this YouTube video and said, let's just make a band with this name, basically. But they were releasing work separately with the name. The first album James released is called Shenmue Online, which is based off of a cult classic Sega Dreamcast video game. Afterwards, Tech Honors released Mystic Quest in February of the same year. The two musicians would release 6 additional albums independently of each other using the same DDS name. The same year, Keith Rankin joins the group with, Keith Rankin joins DDS with James Webster on this album, Evangelus. Keith and James then released I'll Try Living Like This the following year in 2015, and it charts 15 on Fact Magazine's 50th Best Albums of 2015. So this album was actually pretty popular back in 2015 in a lot of like electronic music spaces. At this point, James starts using the name and performing it solo in live shows. In 2017, DDS releases their first joint album with all 3 people. So James Webster, Tech Honors, and Keith Rankin all release an album under the DDS name in 2017. In 2017, Tech and James then start performing the album live with only 2 performers, and they tour the following year in Japan. And then this brings us to the present, where the collaborative album released in 2015 with Keith and James was re-released on 100% Electronica on vinyl last year and then CD this year. So this brings us to this ridiculous slide. So this diagram, and shout out to Machine Angel for putting this together, their Redditor. This Venn diagram shows the relationships between the Death's Dynamic Shroud albums and their actual creators, including which albums were created individually and which ones were created collaboratively. Note that there's only one album, Heavy Black Heart, which was created by all 3 producers. So as you can see, there's 21 albums released under this name with varying relationships of who actually participated on its creation. So I'll just leave that up for a second. So here's how we actually represent this in a MARC environment. A basic NAR was created for Death's Dynamic Shroud with the qualifying subfield C to avoid confusion with the corporate body, right? So subfield C joint pseudonym. A 663 note was added with the text pseudonym used by multiple persons. For works of these performers written under their own or other names, search also under, and then all 3 names are listed. Then the NARs for each 500 are listed in the basic NAR, represented here. They all have the same WNNC that links back to the joint pseudonym record. Note that the errors do not say a real identity, they say alternate identity, but instead say alternate identity. This was chosen again because there's no real way to express this relationship in MARC with the relationship designators, because it's a collaborative name, it's a joint pseudonym, so it gets a little messy depending on how it's used. And since it was chosen as the basic NAR, it's difficult to say what the relationship is. So that's why it's just kind of listed this way. A complex C also reference includes this text here. For all works of this performer written in collaboration with all the names are listed. Search also under Death's Dynamic Shroud, joint pseudonym. So this links everybody in their individual name authority record back to this. And here's the album itself. Lastly, we have Death's Dynamic Shroud, the 2014 album, I'll Try Living Like This, reprinted this year on CD by 100% Electronica. So we're going to listen to a brief clip of CD Player 3 from the album. I'll note that this track CD Player has 4 current incarnations and some albums have it. So this is CD Player 3. Here are the lyrics printed on the container. And here is the relatively blank disc label with just the joint pseudonym name and the title of the album, which are represented here. Statements of responsibility for James Webster and Keith Rankin are printed on the container, seen enlarged here. This information is added in a 508 field, creator production credits note, because they're actually listed as producers. The track list, which is printed on the container as well, is in Korean. This album is also well known for being one of the few vaporwave releases to feature Korean language track titles. The genres almost exclusively relies on Japanese characters, so this was an outlier for a number of reasons. This was represented in MARC by having two 505s, one with the Romanized Korean, as well as the original Korean characters. Lastly are the subject headings. The generic electronics LCMPT is used again, along with electronica music, a narrow term of synth pop music, like we heard in the sample, applied as well as the term glitch music to capture some of the computer glitch and CD skip effects featured in the sound recording. Lastly, a popular music with a geographic subdivision for South Korea was added. This is used because the basis for most works retain their original K-pop elements and still can be heard, like we heard in the last one. I'll also note that K-pop was recently added as a variant term for this heading. So this allows for people who are searching for K-pop to actually find this album. Lastly, vaporwave music was used to completely encapsulate the sound recording. Turns out things were far more complicated than I initially signed up for, hence this going a little bit over. This sound recording resulted in not just one, or 4, but 9 name authority records. This is because Keith and James had works in the catalog under their pseudonyms Winter Sleep, represented here, Scepter Rose, as well as Giant Claw. I typically have a rule of 3, so no more than 3 pseudonyms are created for a single name. However, even with joint pseudonyms, that proves to be very daunting. In conclusion, genre is a conversation. It provides people, groups, and organizations with the shared language of terms and concepts that better facilitate interaction and description with the world around them and amongst themselves. Controlled vocabularies, including taxonomies and ontologies, help better illustrate the relationships between things and concepts. Assigning genres to things and authorized terms from controlled vocabularies provides clarity on what things are, their isness, whereas subject headings, such as LCSH, are useful for describing what things are about or their aboutness. The division between popular music terms and art music terms, specifically electronic music and electronica music, requires further discussion and modernization. The discourse around these genres also conveniently omits the role of hip hop music, which I've been kind of alluding to, but those slides are actually after this in a separate section, but we've seen chopped and screwed music show up pretty constantly, and we can hear it in the actual samples themselves. People use pseudonyms for a variety of reasons, including to create and publish works separate from their real identity or in collaboration with others. Both the name authority file and MARC can show complex relationships between agents. However, updates to MARC with an eye towards linked data provides opportunities to have nuanced discussions about agents and authority control. And I have a video at the end of this, but I don't know if we want to take the time to jump to questions or if we want to just go ahead and watch it. I think it's like 2-ish, 3 minutes maybe.
We could jump into questions now,
Okay.
and see if we have time at the end. We just have a few questions here I want to make sure we have time to get to.
Sure.
So the first question was way back with the balloon music. Oh, and thank you, Leo, for a very thorough and interesting and complex presentation. But the first question starts back at the balloon music, about the term chamber music. The person was saying, I thought chamber music applied to small ensemble music of 2 to 8 players.
Yes. So in this instance, I probably omitted it. So in this instance, I think it would have been more appropriate to use art music, but this sound recording actually had like a better way of explaining it is, it should say art music. It's chamber music because it was for the entire resource. So that was just me. That was just an oversight on my part. I believe it should be art music. But again, it kind of ties into this whole like, it's a balloon and electronics, but they're being played together as a percussion instrument. So there's also this question of like, how many performers are there? There's one person performing, but there's multiple instruments. And then even in the subject heading, it's balloon and electronic music. So there's always a little I think it should be art music, but this was pulled from the record I created a few years ago. So that's just an oversight on my part, but it's a great question.
Can you use electronica music if something predates the labeling of that genre, such as Tonto's Expanding Headband in 1975?
I believe so in that instance. It's like, it's kind of a moving date. It depends on who you talk to, really. I think it's like kind of like, again, 1950s is when you start to see this, like it's kind of moving out of like the so-called Western art music box. You also see a lot of people in the development of musique concrète who didn't come out of Western art music too. So like once you hit 1950s is when you have electronic music, and electronic music also predates that. Like it shows up, you know, at the advent of the radio. It also shows up a little bit earlier than that with like wire recordings. But I think it would be fine if it's 1975. I think like once you're around like 1950, like think rock and roll, right? Like we have this idea of like doo-wop music and then rock and roll. And that's when you have these electronica instruments that kind of come in. They're electronic instruments, but the term electronica doesn't really get supplied until like late 60s, early 70s is the problem. But I think in this instance, you can retroactively apply an appropriate subject heading, unless it's like a situation like jazz is one of those messy situations where once you like, if you start actually looking at it, it's like, oh, this isn't jazz. But in the case of electronica, it's like there's a lot of nuance. And I'll just say like this is kind of the nice thing about having like LCMPT is LCMPT provides opportunities to describe like what's actually going on, which was one of the constraints of LCSH, right? LCSH was had a lot of constraints built around construction, and LCMPT really kind of broke that wide open. And that's also, I think, the case with electronica music. I have a slide at the end here that might help, unless we want to move to another question. Let's see what it did. Oh, how's this work? Okay. I just got to click through these real quick. Oh, it's going to actually make me go through it. All right, let's just do this in the screen share. And then I will let me do that. There we go. Everybody can see this?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this is kind of one of these examples I originally had of like what happens when like you have like electronica separate from like the history of like hip hop music, and like rap music is also this term that kind of floats, like it just kind of exists directly beneath popular music. And so in this case, I don't know if most people remember this, but like Ice-T started off as like a rapper, but before his gangster rap phase, he was actually doing like break dancing and like kind of break beat, like kind of coming out of like post disco, pre hip hop. And he actually performed with a lot of live electronic instruments. Like a lot of the electronic instruments we today associate with like electronica broadly came out of hip hop. And so here we have the term rap music and electronica music, and then the narrower term electro music, which kind of encapsulates like what's kind of going on here. Rap is kind of nuanced because like rap is like it's a verb, it's like a thing you do. And so it's hard sometimes to supply like if rap exists in a thing, it isn't necessarily rap music. It just means there's a rapper involved. So that's the nice thing again about having this LCMPT term. This is a popular music sound recording. So if you follow the best practices for LCMPT, you supply like a generic like singer or whatever terms available. Since I mostly work with like hip hop and rap sound recordings, I actually supply rapper because rapper is a more accurate term to describe what's actually going on. And so in this instance, we have the like very generic rapper term. But if we wanted to, this kind of conflicts with the best practices document. But if you wanted to, you could supply rapper, electric keyboard or electronic keyboard, bass guitar, again, that kind of early example, and synthesizer. I've kind of gotten away from the question, but I think this kind of illustrates like if you get too close to like the 60s or 70s, the term like electric and electronica can get really, really hairy.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Switching gears. Would Witch House be a microgenre of the chopped and screwed microgenre?
Oh, that's a great question. So for anyone who doesn't know, like Witch House is closely associated with this group Purity Ring. And if you think of, I think another example that I might get in trouble for saying is Oh, I'm a blanket. Oh, Death Grips is another one of these groups where it's like, what's going on? What is this? Witch House is interesting because it is like people do consider it to be a microgenre. It kind of shows up in like the late 2000s, early 2010s, around the same time as vaporwave music. So there's actually a lot of like crossover between those artists and producers. But Witch House is considered like fairly dead. I would say, you know, if you have literary warrant and you can justify it with sources, that's kind of the double-edged sword of like literary warrant, is you have to like prove to like a body of people like why a term should exist. And I think K-pop is like a great example, where you have this term that's just kind of broadly assigned to anything coming out of like a country, and it's just kind of like a little absurd because it's like, well, there's like way more going on. Like K-pop's way more diverse than just like catchy BTS tracks. Like there's a lot going on. And the history of a lot of those songs is actually tied to that Sybil conversation we were having before the presentation, where it's like, you know, there's actual New Jack Swing producers that were brought to South Korea and helped like create those bands. So if you listen to like Bobby Brown and listen to like K-pop in the late 80s, early 90s, like you just kind of hear it because it's actually the same producers. And this kind of relationship persists today. So back to the Witch House conversation. So you have to like have literary warrant. K-pop didn't go through, and you can see like the notes from LC. I like look at those because I'm a crazy person and I'm like, I want to know like what we need to do to get like these terms in. And so K-pop, it was basically like, you can't put a lid on it. It's just kind of a generic term. It's just like, yes, popular music from Korea. So they updated the actual geographic subdivision, you know, popular music, Korea South, with K-pop. So it's like, oh, okay, like that was one workaround. In the case of Witch House, it's like, if you have literary warrant, may as well try. But again, make sure you're following the LC GFT document, which is, I think, pretty helpful. And then also realize you might actually have another term that kind of covers it too. Like if you start looking at like shoegaze and some of these other like late 80s, early 90s, like alternative rock genres, there's a lot of like variant terms that show up. And I think Witch House could kind of go either way, because the problem is you've only got like one, you honestly only have like one band that you can say, this is Witch House. So you run the risk of doing all this work and there's one record that a library gets that can use it too. So you kind of have to ask yourself, is it worth the time if it exists outside of the library environment? So that's my 2 cents, but that's a great question. Witch House is really fascinating for a number of reasons. The scene kind of imploded. It kind of destroyed itself by being kind of toxic, unfortunately.
Okay. If you don't have the time to learn microgenres, but you want to add the headings to increase access, what sources are easy or quick for finding out if these genres apply to a title? It'd be Discogs, AllMusic, or something else.
I would say if it's like a modern recording artist and they're releasing music, you could check Bandcamp. Most people usually have, like, again, like this Folksonomy, people usually put those genres in there. Discogs is a mixed bag because it's also like user generated. So either like some people put their own in, which is, I think, actually helpful. But sometimes terms don't always necessarily align. Also, I would note that Discogs has a really fascinating way. They have like they have genres, and then they also have, let me just pull it up real quick. To answer the question in short, yes, seek out whatever the artist is saying they are and presenting themselves as. If there's a term that exists, use that. If there's a broader term that kind of encapsulates it, use that. I oftentimes just have a 500 note that says like whatever the specific thing on, like if they say on Witch House, I could use like electronica music, alternative rock music, and then like maybe vaporwave, depending on what's going on and when they released it. And then I would just have a 500 note that says like Witch House. But I would say Discogs is a great place to start. I will just see if I can pull up All Noises Sound, which I think is super helpful. So I'll do this over here, so it'll be ready to go. I don't know. I mentioned All Noise is Sound. Or yeah, Every Noise at Once. I can never remember what it's called. Okay, all right, here we go. So here's our example. So if you're trying to figure out what's going on, you can just throw the artist name in this website and it'll just tell you. So this is a great resource, everynoise.com. And I'm going to scroll way to the bottom. We're not buying the hoodie, but this is who threw this together. So Glenn McDonald kind of saves catalogers a lot of time. And this is built out of the Spotify API. You'll notice all of the art, all of the Western art music terms are kind of here at the bottom. And then as we scroll up through infinity, it gets a little bit denser. There's some color coordination. And then at the very opposite end, we have Latin Tech House. So let's throw in a Purity Ring. See what we get. So there's your genres. Metropolis, sure. Shimmer, that's actually really interesting. Chill wave, okay. Electropop, so there's, you know, synth pop, right? That's a used for term. Dream pop, again, that hypnagogic pop showing up, dream pop. So I would say the short answer is Every Noise at Once is a great resource if you just want like a quick and dirty. Problem is it's not all necessarily controlled terms. They are, but it's like machine, like again, this kind of folksonomy thing, like a machine just kind of aggregated all of them. And if you want, you know, you can click on, oh, where's it at? It'll give you the audio, if you know what it actually is.
Okay, we have one question about classification and then two more questions about name record creation. So hopefully we can get through those quickly.
Sure.
There's a question, how would music created via modular synthesis be classified?
Ooh, so we talked a little bit about like generative music. Modular synthesis falls into that. You would probably want to use something much broader and then that generic electronics term. My attitude has been, I want to get it in the catalog, and then I have that literary warrant. And then if we have the opportunity to create a proposal to the Seiko Music Funnel, then that's like creates the impetus for that. Like once the literary warrant's there, if you can get it in, then you can kind of go from there. Modular synthesis is really fascinating. I would say that kind of falls into the kind of like algorithmic, like who's actually involved in the process, or is it like someone starts the process and it unfolds? So that could also fall under avant-garde music, right? That's where that term, you know, it's topical, but it's one of those things where like, if there's nothing else, like if it doesn't exist and you can't put a lid on it, and it isn't something that exists with like a geographic subdivision or some other type of subdivision, then I think avant-garde music would be applicable. Because it's really hard to like explain like what's actually going on when you start talking about like processes. Because again, musique concrète can usually revolve and lead to ambient electronica music. Like they're very similar terms, but one's just more explicit and one's the tape work, and then one's just kind of this broad diffuse genre.
Okay. Have you looked into how the new RDA will impact name creation? For example, once the version of RDA with all the 9.1.1.1, et cetera, is gone, what guidelines will you use when deciding to create a NAR and how to create it?
I'm waiting for the application profile to be created, and then I will be giving a lot of feedback. Because right now MLA has a working group, and I know like LC and PCC have different working groups working on these application profiles as like the new RDA is populated. Basically, it's just a little unwieldy because it kind of covers everybody. As far as pseudonymous persons, I would love to see the inclusion of like collective pseudonym. I think that's something that it exists currently in Wikidata. I know OCLC has been working on like basically not a competitor to, I don't know if that's a way to describe it, but they're creating their own kind of Wikidata linked data framework apparatus. And we're basically just waiting for like a metadata editor that can handle linked data at this point. But as far as the new RDA, I'm taking a wait and see approach. And once I kind of see what people are coming up with, I can give some feedback. As far as using it, I just kind of poked around and looked at it. I'm just kind of waiting for that application profile. But a collective pseudonym would be nice to see, joint pseudonym, collective pseudonym, as well as one for what's come up recently, the collectives. I kind of mentioned that kind of collectives thing where it's like not quite a corporate body, not quite a joint pseudonym. It just kind of is this umbrella term. I would be curious to see how something like that's addressed in the new RDA.
I think that's a fair take on the new RDA. Last question. In the case of DDS, why is this considered a pseudonym rather than a band name or corporate heading?
So again, it comes down to usage. With a musical group, it's like just kind of an umbrella term that's used by like everyone in the group participates in the group. It's interesting because we kind of see this with like, I think the example I've thrown around before is like string quartets. It's like if you establish a corporate name for string quartet, the membership can change over time. So look at like the Cornish Quartet, the Juilliard Quartet. Some are associated with a particular place. You can also qualify corporate body names to differentiate between similarly named groups. In the case of Deaf's Dynamic Shroud, because the artists use the name exclusively and produce individual unique works with it, it results in using the joint pseudonym rather than a musical group. Just it's exactly how they use the name. When you actually look them up, it'll say, we're meeting with Deaf's Dynamic Shroud, and it's like one person in the interview. And then they go, oh yeah, like there's other people that use it, like Keith uses it, and we worked on this album together, but we just kind of throw the name around and use it for whatever project we're working on. They still release mixtapes separately, and we actually don't have full attribution for who actually released what mixtape, because it's they use a fan club model. So it's kind of like Patreon through like a Bandcamp interface. So you just join basically a mailing list. You pay like a subscription fee of like $7-10, and then they just mail you a cassette every month. And you don't necessarily know like what member of the group actually produced it. So that's why it's a joint pseudonym, like there's no ownership of it.
Thank you, Leo. If you wanted to share that video, I think we have a couple minutes.
One moment, Leo. We did have one comment that I want to highlight in chat. Patrick said that your knowledge is frighteningly, I can't even say it. Exceptional, anyway.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, you are very thorough. You're very comprehensive on what you're doing here. So
I really appreciate that. It's, it's just a lot of like, I think the best way I heard it described was like catalogers don't know everything. They know where to look. Like it's not just reference, but it's like knowing who to talk to. There's a lot of information that I got from my colleagues. There's a lot of information that I got just like keyword searching the Moog listserv. There are a lot of really bright minds out there. And if you dig hard enough, you'd be really shocked to learn what people know. I just can't shut up, and I really like music. So it's relatively easy for me to throw these things together. And I'll go ahead and put that video on real quick. And I still have the screen share, right?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
And it should still have sound.
So this is the slush wave thing I was talking about before. You're going to hear like some chopped and screwed in here. It should be really interesting. But this video is just kind of amazing. So yeah, just a little something different there.
Wow. Thank you, Leo, for the wonderful and comprehensive presentation you just gave.
I think.
We really appreciate it. In fact, we appreciate all our speakers who are so generous with their generously willing to share their expertise with our members. I just want to remind the members that the link for the presentation recording, PowerPoints, and electronic evaluations will be emailed to you. We look forward to your opinions and ideas on how to make our meetings more useful and enjoyable. So please take a few minutes to fill out the evaluations. Let us know how we did and suggest topics for future meetings. Also, be sure to let us know if you might be interested in serving on the board. Thank you, everyone. Be safe, and we hope to see you again in spring of 2022. The fall 2021 meeting is now adjourned. Thank you.